Section 1: The Hidden Dark Layer Beneath the Laugh Track. There is something deeply strange about the way Family Guy makes you feel comfortable. The theme song plays. The family gathers at the piano. Peter dances his little shuffle step. Lois sings with that familiar warmth. Brian lifts his martini glass. Stewie swings his tiny arms. And somewhere in your brain, a chemical reaction fires that signals safety, familiarity, home. You have watched this opening sequence so many times that it functions almost like a lullaby at this point. The animated suburbs of a small Rhode Island town drift past, and for a moment, everything feels perfectly settled. That feeling is a lie, or rather, it is a half-truth, the comfortable outer shell of something far stranger, and in certain corners, far more disturbing than most people ever take the time to look at properly. Because underneath the laugh track, underneath the cutaway gags and the Peter Griffin pratfalls and the rapid-fire jokes about television from the 1980s, there exists an entire hidden architecture of mysteries, loose ends, unanswered questions, and dark implications that the show has quietly accumulated over more than 25 years of telling stories about this one broken, baffling family in their impossible town. Tonight, that is what we are going to explore. Not the comedy, not the cultural analysis, not a retrospective on what went wrong with the writing after Season 7. You can find that everywhere. What we are going to do tonight is something quieter, and, in its own way, something much more unsettling. We are going to look at Family Guy the way you might look at an old photograph that almost makes complete sense, almost except for one shadow in the corner that should not be there, one face in the background that does not match, one detail that your eye keeps returning to because something about it sits wrong. Family Guy was built on absurdity. That is its whole identity, its entire genetic code, the DNA molecule around which 25+ years of stories have been wrapped. Nothing needs to make sense because the show tells you, from the very first episode, that sense is not the point. Peter Griffin makes no logical sense. A talking dog makes no sense. A baby with a time machine makes no sense. The writers committed to the chaos so completely and so confidently that audiences accepted it as the premise and moved on to just enjoying the jokes. But here is the thing about absurdist universes. When you look at them long enough, when you sit with them long enough, when you stop laughing and start paying attention to the accumulation of details and contradictions and recurring elements that have built up over 25 years of storytelling, patterns begin to emerge. Not random patterns either. Patterns that suggest deeper structures. Patterns that imply questions that the show itself seems either unwilling or unable to answer. Patterns that, when you trace them all the way back to their origin points, lead to places that are genuinely strange. Where exactly is the town of Quahog? And why does its geography keep contradicting itself in ways that suggest it might not be a normal town at all? Who is Stewie Griffin really communicating with? And why do the rules about who can understand him seem to change in ways that point towards something far more complicated than a writing inconsistency? What actually happened to the timeline the night Brian Griffin died, and what did Stewie have to do to unwind it? Why does Peter Griffin have no consistent past, with details about his origins, his parents, his childhood, and even his legal citizenship shifting and contradicting each other across hundreds of episodes? Who is the real father of Meg Griffin? And what does the show's own internal evidence actually suggest about what Lois was doing in the years before Peter came along? Why does an immortal giant chicken keep appearing to fight Peter to the death? And what do we actually know about where that creature came from? And what about all the people who used to live in this story, the characters who vanished, who were quietly written out, who simply stopped appearing one day without explanation? Where did they go? And what does their absence tell us about the world they left behind? These are the questions that tend to keep you company on a quiet night when the lights are low and the episode you put on for background noise has given way to something more like genuine attention. The kind of attention you give to something when you are not quite asleep but not quite fully awake either, drifting in that comfortable middle space where your brain makes connections that it would dismiss as silly if you were sitting up straight in a lit room. That middle space is exactly where Family Guy's mysteries live. They are not the kind of mysteries that demand you sit bolt upright and argue about them loudly. They are the kind that settle around you slowly, like cooling air, until you realize that the comfortable animated sitcom you put on to fall asleep to is actually a machine with much stranger gears than you originally noticed. So settle in. Find a comfortable position. Let your breathing slow down. We have a lot of ground to cover, and none of it is urgent. and all of it is deeply, quietly fascinating. Drop a comment below letting us know where you are watching from and what time it is there. There is something wonderful about people all over the world, in different time zones, in different beds and different chairs, all listening to the same quiet exploration of the same strange town. And if you want to make sure you never miss one of these, there is a subscribe button somewhere on this page that will help with that. It is completely free. It just means more of these find their way to you. Now, let us begin with the town itself. Because before we can understand the mysteries of the people who live there, we need to understand the place, and the place, when you examine it carefully, is one of the most quietly impossible locations in the history of American animated television. Section 2. The Geography Problem. A town that should not exist. Quahog, Rhode Island. If you have spent any amount of time watching Family Guy, that name sits in your head the way a home address does: immediate, automatic, unquestioned. It is simply where the Griffins live. It is simply the town. It exists because the show told you it exists, and television towns do not generally require further examination. But Quahog does, because the more carefully you look at it, the more it begins to reveal itself as a place with a fundamental problem at its core, which is that it cannot quite decide where it is, what it looks like, or how large it is, and those inconsistencies, taken together, paint a picture of a location that seems to exist in a state of perpetual geographic uncertainty. Start with the basic question of where Quahog actually sits within the state of Rhode Island. The show has told us it is in Newport County, and that information comes directly from a birth certificate shown on screen, which is about as official as the show's internal documentation gets. The zip code shown in another episode, 00093, does not correspond to any real Rhode Island postal district, which is itself a small detail worth noting. Rhode Island zip codes begin with 028 or 029. The number 00093 does not exist in the state of Rhode Island. This could simply be a throwaway gag, and probably is, but it also means that from a postal standpoint, letters addressed to the Griffin family at 31 Spooner Street, Quahog, Rhode Island 00093 would vanish into the postal system and never arrive. The town is, in a very literal bureaucratic sense, undeliverable. Now look at what the show actually depicts when it shows you the skyline. The building in the background of many Quahog establishing shots, the tall, recognizable structure visible against the sky, is one financial plaza in Providence, Rhode Island. Fans and Rhode Island residents have mapped this out in considerable detail. The angle at which those buildings appear, and the geographic relationship between the buildings in the background, suggests that Quahog occupies a position somewhere to the west of downtown Providence. Following that geometry across a real map, Quahog would most likely occupy territory that corresponds to Johnston, Cranston, North Providence, or a western portion of Providence itself. Seth MacFarlane, the show's creator, has actually confirmed in various contexts that Quahog was modeled after Cranston, Rhode Island, which tracks with what the skyline suggests. Except that Quahog also has a coastline. Multiple episodes show the town situated directly on the water. Characters go to the beach. There are harbor views. Peter has spent time on boats that he keeps near what appears to be a Quahog waterfront. But Cranston is not on the open coastline the way these episodes depict. Cranston borders Narragansett Bay, which is a different relationship to the water than the wide ocean-adjacent coastline the show occasionally implies. This is before we get into the episode called E Peterbus Unum, in which a zoom-out map sequence appears to place Quahog near Tiverton, Rhode Island, which is more than 17 miles from downtown Providence and sits on the eastern edge of the state near the Massachusetts border. Tiverton is nowhere near where the skyline evidence suggests, and is nowhere near Cranston, and is in a different county than Newport County where the birth certificate places the town. The population of Quahog shifts too. In one episode, Tom Tucker states on air that the town's population is approximately 800 people. 800. That is not a city. That is a village. A small, very quiet village. But the Quahog shown across hundreds of episodes has a full hospital, an arena, a mall, an airport, a university, a civic center, a prison, a news station with a full production team, a marina, a country club, multiple bars and restaurants, a well-staffed police department, and a brewery that apparently sells beer across a regional distribution network. None of that infrastructure exists in a town of 800 people. The streets of Quahog are another puzzle. Spooner Street, where the Griffins live, has been depicted with varying numbers of houses, varying lengths, and a varying cast of neighbors depending on the episode's needs. The distance between Spooner Street and downtown Quahog seems to change from episode to episode, depending on whether the writers want Peter to drive there or walk there. The distance between Quahog and Boston, a reference point used fairly consistently across the show's run, also seems to fluctuate. In some episodes, Boston is a meaningful drive away, the kind of trip you plan for. In others, characters travel between the two locations with the ease of a 10-minute errand. Now, you might say reasonably that all of this is just the nature of animated television. Shows are not built to hold up to rigorous geographic scrutiny. The Simpsons' Springfield is deliberately placed in no specific state. South Park is nominally Colorado but does not behave like the actual Colorado geography would allow. These are cartoon towns, and cartoon towns are allowed to be inconsistent. That is all completely fair, but consider this. The inconsistencies in Quahog's geography are so consistent in their inconsistency that they end up being one of the most reliable things about the town. Quahog always exists. Quahog always has the same key landmarks. The Drunken Clam is always there. The brewery is always there. The hospital, the high school, Spooner Street, these things anchor the show reliably across hundreds of episodes. But the space around those anchors, the distances between them, the relationship of the town to the real world outside it, those things keep shifting. And they shift in a very specific way. They shift to accommodate whatever the episode needs. Which is interesting because it suggests, if you want to read the geography with a more interpretive eye, that Quahog operates less like a fixed location and more like a responsive environment. The town shapes itself around the characters' needs rather than imposing its own fixed reality on them. The hospital is however far away it needs to be for the episode's pacing. The beach is however accessible it needs to be for the story being told. The city limits are wherever the story needs them to be. A town that shapes itself around its inhabitants rather than the other way around. There is a fan theory, and it is one of the longer-running ones in the Family Guy fan community, which proposes that Quahog is a kind of purgatory, not in a melodramatic supernatural sense, but in the structural sense, a place outside of normal space and time where the rules of geography and physics and consequence operate differently than they do in the world outside. Characters survive things that should kill them. The town absorbs catastrophes without lasting damage. Buildings that are destroyed one week are back the next. Characters who die return. Events that reshape the community are undone. The geography refuses to resolve into a single stable location. Whether or not you take that theory seriously on its own terms, the thing it is pointing at is real. Quahog does not behave like a place that exists within a consistent reality. It behaves like a place that exists within a story that keeps reshaping the stage around its players. And once you start noticing that, you cannot quite stop noticing it, because it is everywhere in the way the show constructs its world. The founding mythology of Quahog is its own layer of strangeness, and one that the show touched on once and then mostly left alone. In the episode called Peter's Progress, the show presents an extended flashback to colonial times and reveals that Quahog was founded by a man named Griffin Peterson, a direct ancestor of Peter Griffin, who was exiled to America from England by a king named Stuart. The king, who speaks with an accent and wears clothing that would not be out of place in Stewie Griffin's imagination, sends Peterson to America as punishment. The founding of Quahog, in other words, is woven directly into the Griffin bloodline. The town was not just a place that the Griffins happened to settle in at some point in the 20th century. The town was literally built by someone named Griffin, in a story that mirrors Peter and Stewie's dynamic in ways that feel deliberate. The ancestor who founded the town was sent there by a king who resembles a baby. The town's origin point is the Griffin family, and the current Griffin family lives at its center. That loop, Griffins founding the town, Griffins currently living at its heart, the town shaping itself around the Griffins' needs is either very convenient storytelling, or it is a structural clue to something about the nature of this world that the show has never fully articulated. What we do know is this. Quahog was built as a stage for these specific characters. It has never fully existed independently of them, and when you look at the way its geography refuses to stabilize, the way its population contradicts its evident scale, the way its founding myth ties it directly to the family at its center, you begin to wonder whether the town's instability is not a failure of consistency, but rather an accurate reflection of what kind of place it actually is. A place built around the Griffins. A place that exists because they exist. A place where the rules are whatever the story needs them to be. If that sounds like a description of something other than a real town, you might be right. Section 3. The Stewie Problem. Who is actually listening? Let us talk about Stuart Gilligan Griffin. Specifically, let us talk about the single most quietly disturbing unanswered question about him, the one that sits at the absolute foundation of his character, and that the show spent 20+ years circling without ever fully resolving. Who can hear him? This sounds, on its surface, like a simple writing continuity question. In early seasons, Stewie spoke, people did not respond, and the joke was that only the audience could hear his elaborate villain monologues, while the adults around him heard nothing but baby sounds. Brian could understand him, that was established early and maintained consistently. Everyone else either could not or would not engage with what Stewie was saying. Except that is not quite true, and the exceptions accumulate in a way that eventually stops feeling like mistakes and starts feeling like something stranger. In the very first season, Peter appears to respond to something Stewie says in a bathroom scene. It is brief and ambiguous. He acknowledges Stewie's comment in a way that could be interpreted as genuine comprehension rather than just reacting to the baby's tone. Lois, throughout the early seasons, occasionally responds to specific things Stewie says in ways that go beyond reacting to his mood. She once clearly hears and responds to a direct statement from him in the first season, a moment that contradicts the established premise so cleanly that fan communities have argued about its significance for years. Francis Griffin, Peter's devout stepfather, has had coherent conversations with Stewie. Thelma Griffin, Peter's mother, has clearly heard and understood specific things Stewie has said. Mayor Adam West has responded to Stewie with direct, content-specific replies. Herbert, the elderly neighbor, has engaged with Stewie in ways that suggest clear comprehension. Cleveland and various strangers have, across different episodes, appeared to hear Stewie with varying degrees of clarity. What the show eventually told us, through executive producer Rich Appel in a 2015 interview, is that the rule was never rigid. Within the family, Brian and sometimes Chris could reliably understand Stewie. For the rest of the world, the writers made a judgment call episode by episode. If it was funnier for someone to understand Stewie, they understood him. If it was funnier for them not to, they did not. This is, from a pure craft standpoint, a completely valid approach to a comedic conceit. The joke works both ways, and flexibility lets the writers maximize whatever comedic potential a given scene has. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting, rather than just technically inconsistent. If the rule about who can hear Stewie is entirely situational and comedic, then Stewie's perspective on the world, his sense of himself as a hidden intelligence in a world that cannot perceive him, is based on something that is simply not real. The adults around him are not failing to understand him. They are choosing, or being chosen, to not understand him based on narrative convenience. There is a fan theory, one that gained significant traction after Screen Rant explored it in detail, that reframes the entire show around this observation. What if Family Guy is being told from Stewie's perspective? Not in a literal narrative sense, but in the sense that the reality we are watching is filtered through Stewie's understanding of his world, which is the understanding of a very young child projecting adult comprehension onto adult behavior. In this reading, the adults do not actually ignore Stewie because they cannot hear him. They ignore Stewie because he is a baby, and babies are sometimes ignored. But Stewie's developing mind translates that into something far more elaborate, a world where he possesses hidden intelligence that others are unable to perceive, where Lois's firm parenting style becomes active villainy, where Peter's chaotic behavior becomes the behavior of a bumbling idiot rather than just a fairly ordinary man going about his day in an exaggerated way, where Brian's patience with a talking baby becomes a genuine intellectual friendship. The cutaway gags in this reading are not a stylistic quirk of the show. They are hallucinations. They are the free associative imaginings of a baby's developing mind, which takes the world it experiences and restructures it into something broader and stranger and more cinematic than it actually is. Peter does not really fight a giant chicken. Peter is just someone who once got into a minor scuffle with a man in a costume at a fair, and Stewie's young mind has turned that memory into an epic recurring battle across rooftops and ocean liners. This theory received an interesting amount of implicit support from the season 19 premiere episode called Stewie's First Word, in which the show directly addressed the question of why no one could understand Stewie despite the fact that he had clearly been speaking for years. The episode handled it by having Stewie speak a single word, a word that everyone could understand. And his explanation for why this word broke through when all his other elaborate sentences had not was that the emotion behind it was so intense it forced the word through. Brian explicitly says he does not understand this. Stewie himself says he does not quite understand it either. This is not resolution. This is the show acknowledging the question without answering it, dressing that non-answer in a moment of genuine sweetness, and then moving forward, which is entirely fair. Shows are not required to resolve every mystery they generate, but the non-resolution means the question stays alive, and the question is more interesting than any simple answer would be. Because if Stewie is not simply a misunderstood genius in a world that cannot hear him, if the truth is something more complicated and more human, something about a baby constructing an elaborate interior reality around the ordinary facts of his existence, then everything we think we know about what is real in the Griffin household becomes subject to question. What Stewie hears when Lois speaks, what he sees when he looks at his father, what the time machine actually is, if it is anything other than a toy he plays with in his room while his mother hums to herself in the kitchen downstairs. What the giant plans and schemes and evil genius monologues actually amount to in the world that exists outside his own head. These questions do not have answers in the show. They hover above it. And they make Stewie Griffin, for all his familiarity, for all the merchandise and the Halloween costumes and the quotes you have heard 1,000 times, one of the most genuinely mysterious figures in the show's history. A baby who built a time machine and tried to take over the world. Or a baby who played with his toys and talked to the family dog and looked at the strange, large people around him and tried to make sense of all of it. The show never quite tells you which of those is true. And the longer you sit with both possibilities, the more the second one starts to feel like it might be sadder and more real and more disturbing in a quiet way than all of the elaborate weapons ever were. There is also the question of what it means that Brian, of all the characters in the show, is the consistent exception. Brian always hears Stewie. Brian always engages with him on his own terms. Brian is the one adult who speaks to him as an equal rather than as a baby. And in the fan theory framework, this raises its own question. What does it mean that the only character who reliably enters Stewie's reality is a dog? Is Brian's comprehension a sign of something special about the dog? Or is it the easiest place for a child's imagination to project genuine understanding? Because a dog cannot contradict the projection, cannot tell you that you misread his expression, cannot explain that he was not actually agreeing with your plan? The dog listens. The dog responds. The dog goes on adventures. In the world of Stewie's imagination, the dog becomes his truest companion, his voice of reason, his window into the adult world, his best friend. And in the world of the actual show, that friendship became one of the most consistently moving relationships in animated television. Whether it grew out of something real between them, or whether it grew out of something that Stewie needed to be true, perhaps the answer to that is less important than the friendship itself. But the question lingers. A baby and his dog going on adventures through a world that might be entirely constructed from the inside of one very small, very complicated mind. That is where Stewie Griffin lives. Section 4. The Night Brian Died, and What It Unraveled. The date was the 24th of November 2013. Season 12, Episode 6. The episode was called Life of Brian. And on that night, Family Guy did something that it had spent 14 years telling audiences it would never actually do. It killed off one of its core cast members. It put Brian Griffin in front of a car, let the car win, and then spent the remainder of the episode in a register of grief that the show almost never attempted. The Griffins stood in a veterinary clinic and said goodbye to the dog who had lived in their house since before Meg was a teenager. Stewie held it together as long as he could and then did not. Brian, fading on the operating table, told each of them that he loved them. It was genuinely moving. For an animated comedy that spent the better part of a decade replacing real emotion with loud jokes, this moment landed with the weight of something earned. People cried. The internet did not just talk about it, it flooded. Petitions were filed to bring Brian back. Facebook pages were created. Seth MacFarlane later stated in interviews that the team was genuinely surprised by the level of emotional response, that they had expected some reaction but not the depth of feeling that the episode generated. Then, 2 episodes later, Brian was back. Christmas Guy, Season 12, Episode 8. Stewie, grieving and determined, happened to spot a past version of himself in a toy store. The past version was carrying a time travel return pad that the present version no longer had. Stewie took it from his past self, used it to go back to the moment before Brian was hit by the car, and saved him. Brian came back. The new dog who had replaced him, Vinny, vanished from the timeline. The world reset to what it had been before the car appeared on that street, and the response from fans shifted from grief to anger. The death was a rating stunt. That is the interpretation that hardened in most people's minds, and it is difficult to argue with as an interpretation. The show killed a major character, generated an enormous amount of cultural conversation and emotional engagement, and then undid it as quickly as was narratively possible. The cycle from death to resurrection lasted 3 episodes, 3 weeks of airtime. Less time than it takes for the emotional impact of a TV event to fully settle before it was reversed. But set aside for a moment the question of whether it was emotionally manipulative. Set aside the craft debate. Because there is something about the mechanics of Brian's death and resurrection that, when you look at it closely, is genuinely strange. Strange in a way that exists within the show's own internal logic, and that the show itself seems not to have fully reckoned with. When Stewie went back in time to save Brian, he used a return pad belonging to a version of himself from another timeline. A version of himself who had traveled forward in time to buy Christmas toys before the crowds arrived, an event that had been briefly mentioned earlier in the episode. That past Stewie had a return pad. Present Stewie took it. This means that when present Stewie used that pad to go back and prevent Brian's death, he used technology that belonged to a timeline that was itself already slightly different from the original timeline. He was not cleanly retracing history. He was borrowing a device from a parallel track. The implications of this are not insignificant within the show's established time travel mechanics. When Stewie saved Brian, the timeline did not simply revert. The timeline was altered from a branching point created by the action of a version of Stewie who had traveled forward in time for Christmas shopping. The original timeline in which Brian was not hit by a car is not precisely the same timeline that was restored. It is something close to it, but built on a slightly different foundation, a timeline in which a version of Stewie performed a time travel action that he was prompted to perform because of witnessing the aftermath of Brian's death, an aftermath that no longer happened in the restored timeline. This is the kind of thing that theoretical physics would call a causal loop with a paradox at its foundation, and while Family Guy is not a show about theoretical physics, it is a show that built an entire mythology around time travel and the consequences of altering the past. That mythology, from Stewie's various missions through history to the multiverse device to countless altered timelines, operates with enough internal consistency that the paradox at the heart of Brian's resurrection is not dismissible as just a cartoon inconsistency. The Brian who came back from Stewie's intervention is not the same Brian who died. He is a Brian from a branch of the timeline that was repaired using tools from yet another branch. Whether he is functionally identical to the original Brian, same memories, same experiences, same connection to Stewie, is something the show treats as a non-question. He is Brian. He is back. Life continues. But within the universe's own rules, a copy of Brian returned from an altered timeline. The original Brian died on a street in front of a hockey net, with his family around him saying goodbye. That original Brian is still dead somewhere in the wreckage of the timeline that Stewie unspooled. The show never addresses this. The grief that the Griffins felt in that week between Life of Brian and Christmas Guy was real grief within the show's world. They lost someone genuinely, processed it, began to move forward. Then a version of their dog came back from a fixed branch of causality, and they never had to talk about any of that grief again. The man who hit Brian with the car was never caught. This detail is noted in the TV Tropes recap of the episode, which observes that Joe Swanson attends the funeral and expresses confusion about how a woman who scolded him for not finding the driver even knew Brian. The driver who killed Brian was never identified, never found, never brought to any kind of narrative accountability, in any kind of procedural framework, and the show has been known to engage with procedural structures when it suits the story. This is a hanging thread. Somewhere in whatever version of the timeline still holds memory of those events, a driver who struck and killed a member of the Griffin family is simply out there, untroubled. There is also the question of what Brian himself experienced during those 3 episodes. Within the show's metaphysics, and the show has an afterlife with a quite specific geography, including God, death, and a functional heaven, Brian was, briefly, dead. He had a death scene. He said his goodbyes. He expired. Where did he go between the moment of his death and the moment Stewie rewrote history? The show's afterlife appears multiple times across its run. Death is a character, God is a character. Characters have visited both and returned. Brian, who in life was a committed atheist and who argued against religious belief in multiple episodes, died and entered whatever system the Family Guy universe uses for processing deaths. He was there, in some form, for a period of time. He believed things about death and afterlife that may or may not have been accurate. And then he was removed from that situation retroactively, restored to the moment before it happened, and the version of him who emerged presumably has no memory of anything that occurred in the interval. The version of Brian who came back has no idea what he experienced. The audience has no idea what he experienced. Whether his atheism held up in whatever place he briefly occupied is a question the show absolutely does not ask and probably never will. But it lingers there, in the margins of those 3 episodes, like something that was meant to be addressed and then decided was too complicated. Brian Griffin died. Brian Griffin returned. And neither event quite worked the way the show thought it did. The death was supposed to be permanent and then wasn't. The return was supposed to be clean and then wasn't quite. At least not when you examine the mechanics. And in between those 2 events, somewhere in the ruins of an altered timeline, something happened to a character that the show created and loved, and then decided to make convenient rather than complete. Section 5. The Multiverse and What Lives in It. Season 8, Episode 1. The 27th of September 2009. Road to the Multiverse. This is the episode where Family Guy stopped being just a show about a dysfunctional family in an impossible town and became, officially and explicitly, a show set in a universe where infinite alternate realities exist simultaneously alongside the one we are watching. Stewie had already built a time machine by this point, but a time machine implies a single continuous timeline with branches. A multiverse device implies something far more vertiginous than that. It implies that the world we watch, the one with Peter and Lois and the drunken clam and the brewery and all the rest of it, is one of an infinite number of simultaneously existing versions of that world, each equally real, each occupying its own parallel dimensional plane. This is not a small thing for a comedy show to do. It is not a small thing for any show to do. The moment you establish an actual functional multiverse within a narrative, every story decision that came before it, and every story decision that comes after it, sits within a fundamentally different philosophical frame. Because if infinite versions of these characters exist, then every story the show has ever told has a version in which it ended differently. Every death has a universe where it did not happen. Every relationship has a universe where it resolved another way. Every random event has a version where it went left instead of right. The episode itself is one of the most beloved in the entire series, a technical achievement that demonstrated the range of animation styles the production could deploy, and a genuinely creative piece of storytelling that let Brian and Stewie visit a series of alternate realities, each rendered in a different visual mode. The universes visited include one where Christianity never developed, and humanity has consequently advanced technologically by 1,000 years. One where Japan won World War II. One that functions exactly like a Disney animated feature, complete with its own original song. One styled as a Flintstones episode. One that exists in live-action reality, meaning our reality, the actual physical world where Brian and Stewie appear as crude puppets among real humans. One where dogs are the dominant species and humans exist as pets. That last one deserves particular attention. The world where dogs rule and humans are pets is introduced as a dark joke at Brian's expense. He is suddenly the privileged species, the one with rights and social standing and a comfortable place in the social order, while humans are kept as companions and scold when they soil the rug. Brian is immediately comfortable in this world. Stewie is immediately uncomfortable. The episode uses this reversal for broad comedy, but the implication sits there long after the laugh fades. If a universe exists where dogs are dominant and within the multiverse framework the episode establishes, every possible universe exists, then there is also a universe where Stewie's schemes succeeded. A universe where Stewie did take over the world and became the dictator he always planned to be. A universe where Brian died and stayed dead. A universe where Meg Griffin was treated with the dignity and care she deserved. A universe where Peter Griffin never changed from the lovable, if chaotic, father of the early seasons into the crueler version the show eventually built. These are not just abstract possibilities. Within the mechanics the show established in Road to the Multiverse, they are real. They are happening right now from the perspective of the multiverse. Somewhere in the infinite parallel structure of the Family Guy universe, a version of Meg is happy. Somewhere in it, a version of Brian is alive and well in a timeline that was never altered. Somewhere in it, Stewie is sitting on a throne made from the ruins of the civilization he conquered, and the little British accented dictator who used to live in that yellow shirt finally got what he always said he wanted. The show does not return to this. It establishes the multiverse, uses it brilliantly for one episode, and then largely treats it as a tool for Brian and Stewie adventure episodes rather than as the genuinely staggering implication it represents. This is probably the correct creative decision. A show that spent every episode grappling with the philosophical weight of its own multiverse would not be Family Guy anymore. It would be something else entirely. But the multiverse is there. It is real within the show's fiction. And once it is real, it is always real, humming quietly beneath the surface of every episode that came before it and every episode that came after, a reminder that the story we are watching is one of infinite stories, that the characters we care about are one set of infinite versions of those characters, and that whatever happens in this particular branch of reality, every other possibility is equally true somewhere else. Within the multiverse framework, there is also the question of what the show's alternate universe episodes reveal about the nature of this specific universe, the one we watch. When Brian and Stewie visit the world where Christianity never existed and science has advanced by 1,000 years, the quahog they find is beautiful and vast and luminous. When they visit the dog-dominated world, the quahog they find is organized and affluent and clean. When they briefly pass through the live-action world, our world Family Guy, characters as crude hand puppets in a real American town, the implicit comment is that the world of the show is a construction, a deliberate artifice placed over a real substrate. That comment lands differently after 25 seasons than it did in 2009. Because the world of the show has changed so much, has bent so far from its original shape, has become so different from what it was when that first episode aired in 1999. The family and the construction has changed. The town has stayed the same in its essentials but shifted in its details. The relationships have warped. The character who lives inside that yellow shirt is not the same character who once wore it. And somewhere in the multiverse, the original version of all of them is still there, still unchanged, still exactly as they were designed to be at the beginning, living their lives in a version of Quahog that still functions on warmth and consequence and heart. Section 6. Meg Griffin's True Identity and the Mystery of Stan Thompson. In Season 3, Episode 10 of Family Guy, an episode called Screwed the Pooch, Brian Griffin takes the stand in a courtroom. The circumstances are somewhat absurd, as Family Guy circumstances tend to be. Brian is being questioned about his qualifications as a father figure, and the questioner is Peter Griffin, who is trying to prove a point by demonstrating that he knows more about his children than Brian does. The exchange goes like this. Peter asks Brian to identify the real father of Meg Griffin. Brian responds with 2 words, Stan Thompson. Meg is sitting right there at this moment. She is wearing headphones and cannot hear the answer. That was it. That was the full revelation. 2 words, delivered in passing, received by no one in the scene, never followed up on in any meaningful way across the show's subsequent run. The real father of Meg Griffin, delivered as a casual courtroom exhibit and then filed away forever. Stan Thompson. A name with no face attached to it. A name with no episode built around it. A name that implies an entire backstory. Who was Stan Thompson? What was Lois doing with him? When did this happen? Does Peter know? Does anyone know? Is this why Peter treats Meg so differently than he treats Chris and Stewie, that the show has never chosen to explore? What the show did confirm is that Meg's birth name is not even straightforwardly Meg. The Family Guy wiki entry on Meg Griffin gives her name as Megan Harvey Oswald Griffin, though the show has played with her name across various episodes. The middle name Harvey Oswald is, depending on how charitably you read it, either a reference to Lee Harvey Oswald that serves as a dark joke about her general place in the family's estimation, or just another piece of the show's deliberately unstable internal continuity. Her father apparently changed her birth certificate from Megan to Megatron after her mother had already chosen the name, a detail delivered in the episode A Fistful of Meg, which says something about how Peter related to his ostensible firstborn child from very early on. The Stan Thompson revelation, when you sit with it, opens several uncomfortable doors. The most immediate is the question of what Lois was doing before she married Peter. Lois Pewterschmidt from the obscenely wealthy family, The beautiful young woman who apparently defied her parents to marry a poor factory worker from Quahog had at least one relationship significant enough that it produced a child before she settled down with Peter. Or, if the timeline works differently, she had that relationship at some point around the time she and Peter were together, which introduces a different and darker set of implications. The show has actually touched on Lois's past in ways that make it more complex than her surface presentation suggests. In various episodes across the show's run, it is revealed that Lois was not always the patient, put-upon housewife she appears to be. She was a drug addict in college. She shoplifted compulsively. She had what appeared to be a serious, wild streak that her wealthy upbringing failed to fully contain. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is hinted in a line subtle enough that many viewers miss it to have abused her as a child. Carter, waking from sleep in one episode, mumbles something about taking Lois's temperature that registers as deeply disturbing in context, a detail slipped into a comedy scene that sits in the stomach long after the episode ends. If the pattern emerging from these scattered details is correct, Carter's implied abuse of Lois's subsequent self-destructive behaviors in college, the mystery of Stan Thompson and Meg's actual parentage, then the family history behind the Griffin household is considerably darker than the show's bright color palette and cheerful theme song suggest. The dysfunction is not just Peter being dumb and lovable. The dysfunction has roots that extend back a generation, into a wealthy family that maintained the surface appearance of stability while something considerably uglier operated underneath it. There is another layer to the Meg mystery that does not get discussed as often as the Stan Thompson revelation. Multiple episodes across the show's run have touched on the possibility that Meg was not just the product of a different man. She was a child who was not supposed to exist at all. In the show's canon, it is stated at various points that Peter and Lois did not plan to have Meg, that her birth was unexpected, and that Peter's immediate reaction upon learning the baby was a girl was visible disappointment. An episode featuring a flashback to when Meg was a newborn shows Peter and Lois attempting to leave her at a fire station, a baby surrender, only to be talked out of it or distracted before completing the act. This is presented as a dark comedy joke. The punchline is that Peter and Lois genuinely tried to abandon their infant daughter. The audience is supposed to laugh at the absurdity of it, but within the context of Stan Thompson and everything that detail implies, the joke develops a different texture. If Meg is not Peter's biological daughter, and Peter on some level knows or suspects this, whether from a comment made in passing by someone who knew, or simply from the absence of any resemblance he can identify, or from something Lois told him in a moment of honesty that was later buried, then his treatment of Meg throughout the show's run becomes something more specific than just random cruelty. It becomes the behavior of a man who has been raising a child he did not make for a reason he resents, taking that resentment out on the most convenient available target. This does not make his behavior acceptable. It makes it comprehensible in a way that is arguably more disturbing than incomprehensible cruelty, because comprehensible cruelty has a logic to it. There is a pattern. There is a cause. And if that cause connects back to something Carter Pewterschmidt did or did not do in the years when Lois was growing up, and to the choices Lois made in the wake of whatever her childhood actually contained, then Meg Griffin is not just a punching bag. She is the endpoint of a chain of cause and effect that stretches back decades before her birth, the person who absorbed all the consequences of things that happened to people who came before her. The show never tells us who Stan Thompson is. He has never appeared on screen. He has never been referenced again in any episode with the kind of weight the original mentions seem to promise. He remains 2 words spoken in a courtroom, while the person those words most concerned sat listening to music she had chosen to put between herself and the world. That detail, Meg's headphones in that moment, the fact that she could not hear the answer, is the kind of thing that lands differently the longer you look at it. The show arranging the scene so that the single most important piece of information about Meg's identity is spoken in the one moment when she has deliberately blocked out the sound of the world around her. Whether that was intentional irony on the writer's part or simply a convenient way to keep the revelation secret from the character, either way, the image it produces is quietly devastating. Meg Griffin, sitting there with her headphones on, not hearing the answer, not knowing. Section 7. Peter Griffin's missing history and the man who was born wrong. Peter Lovenbroy Griffin was born in Mexico. His mother Thelma was there seeking an abortion. The procedure began. Peter was born instead. Thelma, struck by an unexpected maternal feeling upon seeing her son for the first time, took him home to Rhode Island without ever completing the necessary paperwork to establish his citizenship. Peter Griffin, one of the most recognizably American characters in American animated television history. The working-class New England man with the accent and the brewery job, and the lifelong relationship with domestic beer is, by the show's own internal documentation, an undocumented immigrant from Mexico. This is confirmed in Season 6, Episode 2, Padre de Familia, when Peter investigates his own history after a company-wide citizenship check at the brewery forces him to look into his papers. The revelation is played primarily for comedy, a quick series of jokes about American identity and immigration, the kind of politically charged joke that Family Guy has always been willing to take. But the actual information embedded in the comedy is very real within the show's continuity. Peter Griffin has no legal citizenship papers. He was born on foreign soil, brought home illegally by a mother who decided after the fact that she wanted to keep him, and raised in a household headed by a man who was not his biological father. That man was Francis Griffin, a devout, strict Irish-American Catholic who made Peter's childhood difficult in ways that the show's flashbacks have depicted with a consistency that goes beyond typical sitcom backstory. Francis was hard on Peter. He was not physically warm. He enforced religious observance with a rigidity that felt punitive rather than loving. He disapproved of Lois from the moment she entered Peter's life, specifically because she was not Irish and was not Catholic in the way he required. He spent the entirety of Peter's adult life making his son feel inadequate, and Francis was not even Peter's father. Peter's biological father, revealed in Season 5's Peter's Two Dads, is a man named Mickey McFinnigan, an Irishman living in a small village in Ireland who, when Peter and Brian travel to find him, turns out to be the town drunk. This is both a joke and a character revelation, and it functions as both simultaneously. Peter proves his paternity to Mickey by beating him in a drinking contest, because the only qualifying trait Mickey seems to have bequeathed his son is the capacity to metabolize enormous quantities of alcohol. Mickey accepts Peter as his son on the basis of this genetic inheritance. So what we have is this: Peter Griffin, born in Mexico to a mother who initially did not want him, raised by a Catholic stepfather who disapproved of him, whose biological father is a cheerful Irish alcoholic who carries no legal citizenship in the country where he has lived his entire life, who works at a brewery under a name that was not technically his on any official document until his mother retroactively attempted to fix the paperwork. And then there is his actual birth name. According to documents shown on screen in the episode Quagmire's Mom, Peter's legal birth name is Justin Peter Griffin. Not Peter, Justin. The name he goes by, the name everyone calls him, the name that is functionally his entire identity as a cultural figure is a middle name. His legal first name is Justin, a name that appears nowhere in his daily life, and that the show reveals and then immediately stops referencing. Peter's past also contains a gap that has never been adequately explained, which is the period between his early adulthood and his establishment at the family home on Spooner Street. The show has filled this gap with flashbacks across its run, but those flashbacks contradict each other with a frequency that goes beyond normal narrative continuity issues. Peter's first job was at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, a fact established early and confirmed across multiple episodes. But his relationships before Lois, the timeline of his friendship with Cleveland and Joe and Quagmire, the sequence of events leading up to his marriage, these shift depending on the episode telling them. The episode Peter's Progress attempts to construct a long-view historical relationship between the Griffin family and the founding of Quahog by showing Peter as a reincarnation of Griffin Peterson, the town's founder. Whether the show intends this as literal metaphysics or comedic mythology is ambiguous, but within the context of everything else we know about Peter's impossible-to-pin-down past, the idea that his history keeps shifting because it is connected to something larger than just one man's biography has a certain internal coherence. Peter Griffin arrived in Quahog as if from nowhere. Born on foreign soil, named something he does not use, fathered by a man he did not know, raised by a man who did not love him easily, with no legal claim to the country he calls home. And yet he is the most settled character in the show. He is the axis around which everything else turns. The town bends around him. The family organizes itself around him. History, in at least one episode, seems to originate in him. The man with no stable past is somehow the foundation on which everything else is built. That tension between Peter's completely unmoored personal history and his absolute centrality to the show's world is one of the more interesting structural mysteries in the entire show. It suggests that identity in Family Guy is not about origins. It is not about where you came from, who your parents were, what your legal name is, or whether your papers are in order. It is about occupying the center of the story with enough force and enough weight that everything else organizes itself around your presence. Peter Griffin is real because he acts real enough and loudly enough, and with enough conviction that the world around him responds to him as if he is real. His origin is a void. His present is absolute. Section 8. Lois Griffin and the life she had before. Lois Griffin is the character that most of the audience most consistently takes for granted. This is by design. From the very first episode, Lois exists in a specific structural role, the reasonable one. The one who tries to impose order on the chaos that Peter generates. The one who loves her husband despite his obvious problems. The patient voice in a household full of chaos. She is drawn in warmer colors than the rest of the characters, literally and figuratively, and she is given a softness that functions as a kind of visual shorthand for safety. This character, the color palette tells you, is the one you can trust. But Lois Pewterschmidt Griffin has a past that the show has revealed in fragments across its run, and when you assemble those fragments, the picture they make is significantly more complex than the surface presentation suggests. She grew up wealthy, extremely wealthy, the kind of wealthy that insulates you so completely from consequence that the normal social rules simply do not apply in the same way they apply to everyone else. The Pewterschmidt family has a mansion, a staff, a social position in Quahog that functions like minor aristocracy. Carter Pewterschmidt is one of the most powerful men in the area, with business interests extensive enough that the show has used his ability to alter the physical world of Quahog, buying things, selling things, demolishing buildings, hiring and firing as a recurring plot element. Growing up in that environment, with that much insulation, Lois developed some behaviors that the show has confirmed across various episodes. She was a drug user in college. Not experimentation, actual drug use significant enough that it comes up as a genuine character beat rather than just a throwaway joke in at least 2 separate contexts. She shoplifted compulsively for a period of her adult life, and the impulse was significant enough that it became an episode-length storyline when it resurfaced. She had sexual relationships before Peter that the show has treated as a source of both comedy and mild revelation, including the Stan Thompson relationship that appears to have produced Meg. Carter Pewterschmidt, her father, is a man who loves his daughter in the proprietary, controlling way that some very wealthy men love their children as assets to be managed, not as people to be known. He disapproved of Peter from the beginning with a vehemence that goes well beyond snobbery. His attempts across many episodes to break up the Griffin marriage, to undermine Peter's confidence, to manipulate Lois back into the social orbit he considers appropriate for her, suggest a man who has never fully accepted that his daughter made a choice about her own life that he did not authorize. The implication, dropped in one episode in a line so brief it could be missed without concentrated attention, that Carter abused Lois as a child, if that implication is taken seriously, rather than dismissed as a dark joke, would provide a coherent explanation for several things about Lois that otherwise seem inconsistent. Her choice to marry a man her family opposed, specifically a man who is gentle with her even when he is chaotic in every other direction, her compulsive behaviors, her patience with Peter's disorder, which looks from the outside like resignation, but might be experienced internally as something more like relief. The relief of a person who grew up with something far more controlled and far more predatory than a bumbling husband. Her relationship with her own children, which oscillates between genuine warmth and moments of coldness that come from nowhere and shock the audience. There is also the question of Lois's brother Patrick Pewterschmidt, a character introduced in Season 4's The Fat Guy Strangler. Patrick, it is revealed, was institutionalized by Carter and removed from the family record after he suffered a mental breakdown. The breakdown's cause: he witnessed his mother Barbara having sex with Jackie Gleason, a trauma that apparently led him to develop a compulsive hatred of overweight men, which he acted on by strangling them. Patrick was not just quietly sent away, he was erased. Carter pretended he did not exist. Lois discovered her brother only by looking very carefully at a family photograph and noticing a figure that had been effectively written out of the family narrative. Carter, when confronted, acknowledged what he had done without real remorse. A man who could do that to his son can do many things. A man who erased his own child from the official family record because the child's existence was inconvenient is a man operating with a particular kind of coldness that does not stop at one action. The suggestion of abuse toward Lois, delivered in a single, ambiguous, sleepy mumble in one episode, sits differently when placed next to the documented reality of what Carter did to Patrick. Lois left all of that behind when she chose Peter. She did not just marry down in the conventional social sense. She married away from the family structure, away from the estate, away from the father who may have done things in her childhood that she has spent her adult life working very hard not to think about too directly. And she built a family that has its own problems, its own chaos, its own darkness. But at the center of her family is a man who, for all his catastrophic failings, has never controlled her, has never erased her, has never made her invisible. Peter Griffin, for all that the later seasons did to him, started as a man who simply and completely loved his wife, who made terrible decisions and then came home and told her he was sorry and meant it, who was chaos in every direction and stillness only with her. Whatever Lois's history actually contains, and the show has given us enough to suggest it is darker than most viewers have fully reckoned with, she chose Peter. And the show, at its best, understood exactly how much weight that choice carried, even if it never stated it plainly. Section 9. The Dark Mythology of Death, God, and the Afterlife. Family Guy has a God, and a death, and a heaven, and, in at least one episode, a functioning cosmology that includes angels, divine intervention, and a fairly specific vision of what happens to people after they die. Unlike its contemporary animated shows, which treat the supernatural as purely comedic territory to be exploited for jokes without any particular internal consistency, Family Guy has actually built, across its run, a surprisingly coherent picture of what the metaphysical landscape of its universe looks like. It is not a conventional religious picture, and it is certainly not a reverent one, but it is more internally consistent than the show's reputation for chaos would lead you to expect, and the details it accumulates about the nature of death and afterlife in this universe are, when laid out together, genuinely strange. Death first appears in Season 1 and is given a name not the Grim Reaper's traditional title, just death and a personality that is both mundane and quietly melancholy. He is pale, robed, skeletal in the traditional visual sense, but he has parents. He gets sick. He wants to be liked. He is annoyed when Peter forces him into a situation where Peter temporarily takes over his job of collecting souls, because Death twisted his ankle and needed someone to cover for him while he recovered. Death has an ankle. Death can sprain it. Death recovers from sprains, apparently, which raises questions about what kind of body Death has and what the healing process looks like for an entity whose entire function is to escort the living into the next existence. God appears in multiple episodes and is depicted as a comfortable, middle-aged male entity who operates a kind of casual celestial household and who appears to have the same mild frustrations with the human beings below him that a parent might have with children who are making a series of decisions. The parent knows are bad. He is not an omnipotent God in any strict theological sense within the show's fiction. He makes deals. He gets pulled into storylines. He can be influenced by argument. In one episode, Peter directly convinces God to do something differently. God agrees to think about it. The impression given is of a being who is very powerful and very busy, and perhaps slightly more improvised in his management of the universe than official doctrine would typically suggest. Heaven appears in the episode Meet the Quagmires, in which Brian and Peter travel back in time. The episode's mechanics briefly brush against the show's afterlife architecture. Characters who have died in the show's run, and there have been several over the years, both minor supporting characters and a few major ones appear to have gone somewhere after their deaths, and that somewhere has consistent properties from episode to episode. It is recognizably heaven-shaped, comfortable, well-lit, populated by the deceased who are now in a state of satisfaction that was not available to them during their lives. The show's treatment of hell is more oblique. When it appears, it tends to be used as a comedic setting rather than an atmospheric one. Hell as a bureaucratic inconvenience. Hell as a place where the tortured souls are mostly annoyed rather than anguished. This is consistent with the show's general discomfort with genuine darkness in its cosmological architecture, which tends to domesticate the supernatural rather than allow it to be actually threatening. But here is what makes the afterlife architecture genuinely puzzling when you look at it carefully. The show has characters die and come back with regularity that exceeds what any consistent death mythology should allow. Peter has technically died on multiple occasions, been killed or been at death's door, and been returned to his life through mechanisms that range from divine intervention to simple cartoon reset to the time travel mechanics that Stewie controls. Brian died and was brought back. Various supporting characters have been killed and occasionally resurrected. The character of Death himself has been incapacitated, which logically means that during the period of his incapacitation, no one in the show's universe was actually dying. A cosmological crisis that the episode treats as a minor logistical headache. What this creates is an afterlife that exists as a real destination within the show's cosmology. Characters go there. It is depicted with specificity. It has properties and rules, but that functions in practice as a revolving door rather than a final resting place. The finality that death carries in the real world, the weight that makes mortality meaningful, is absent in Quahog in a very specific way. Characters can be brought back. Timelines can be rewritten. The mechanisms exist to undo death's finality, and they get used repeatedly across the show's run. What that means for the characters who inhabit this universe is interesting to consider. If you live in a world where death is not reliably final, where the mechanisms of resurrection are available to those with the right technology or the right connections, then the existential weight of mortality simply does not operate in the same way it operates in reality. Characters in Quahog do not live under the full pressure of their own finitude because their finitude is negotiable. This connects interestingly to the purgatory theory that runs through the fan community, a place where no one reliably stays dead, where the same events keep resetting, where the world refuses to accumulate permanent consequences from the actions of its inhabitants. This does not behave like a living world. It behaves like a place that has been stripped of mortality's normal mechanics, a place where the stakes of any given moment are perpetually managed down to something manageable. The afterlife in Family Guy is real, it is specific, and it is systematically defanged of everything that makes it actually matter, which either means the show is just not interested in engaging seriously with mortality, which is a fair artistic choice and probably the correct interpretation, or it means something slightly stranger about the nature of the world these characters inhabit, a world that has death on its books as a real institution but consistently declines to enforce it with full seriousness. Section 10. The Chicken Fight Mystery. Who is Ernie really? There is a recurring element in Family Guy that is, on its surface, one of the show's most purely comedic devices, and yet the more you look at it, the more a genuinely strange set of questions accumulates around it. Ernie the Giant Chicken. If you have watched Family Guy, you know the setup. Peter is going about his ordinary life. A massive anthropomorphic rooster appears. Without preamble or transition, Peter and the chicken are fighting not a quick brawl, but an extended, cinematically elaborate, fully choreographed battle that takes them across streets, through buildings, onto boats, across rooftops, through airports, down into sewers, and into any other dramatic space the animators feel like deploying. The fights are genuinely impressive pieces of animation, kinetic, detailed, constructed with more care than most of the actual episode content that surrounds them. They go on for minutes. They destroy property on a scale that would, in any realistic civic context, represent millions of dollars of damage. Bystanders are occasionally killed. Peter is badly injured each time. And then it ends, usually with Ernie apparently dying, and then Ernie getting up again after Peter has turned his back and walked away, establishing that the next fight is already waiting. The explanation the show provides for the origin of this conflict is one of the most deliberately anticlimactic pieces of backstory in television history. The feud began because Ernie gave Peter a coupon that had expired. That was it. An expired coupon, given in what may or may not have been good faith. Peter refused to honor the coupon's expiration. Ernie took offense. Decades of apocalyptic violence resulted. This is, clearly, a comedy premise. The joke is the gap between the cause and expired coupon and the effect annual battles that reshape city blocks and leave civilians as collateral damage. The disproportionality is the comedy. The first time you see it, it is brilliant. The absurdist commitment is total, and it earns its laughs completely. But Ernie is also something else, and it becomes clear the more you think about him. He is unkillable. This is not ambiguous. Across every single fight, Peter appears to win. Ernie is stabbed, hanged, shot, crushed, thrown into industrial machinery, decapitated by airplane propellers, roasted by rocket engines, and drowned. Each time, after Peter turns his back, Ernie gets up. He survives every single method of destruction that is visited upon him. The Family Guy Villains Wiki notes that Ernie demonstrates apparent immortality, that injuries which should be fatal simply are not, that he recovers from things that would kill any ordinary creature and returns as fully functional as he was before the encounter. There is also a detail from the episode Meet the Quagmires, in which Peter travels back in time to the 1980s and accidentally punches Ernie at a dance. A friend of young Ernie's tells him to calm down, that he will probably never see Peter again. This means the feud has a temporal origin point that Peter himself created by interfering in his own past. The causal loop here is interesting. Peter fights Ernie in the present because of a grudge rooted in an expired coupon. But the grudge itself may have been seeded by Peter accidentally punching Ernie in the past during a time travel excursion that happened because Peter was already embedded in the feud in the present. Did Ernie give Peter the expired coupon because he was already angry from being punched at the dance? Or did the expired coupon come first, and the time travel event simply provided an additional grievance that compounded into something larger? The show does not resolve this cleanly, and the timeline of grievances appears to form a loop with no clear entry point. There is a community of fans who have noted something specific about Ernie that goes beyond the obvious comedy. In the episode Life of Brian, the episode in which Brian is killed by a hit-and-run driver, the show includes a brief scene at the veterinary clinic where Brian is dying, and in the waiting area there is a headless chicken. A detail played as a quick dark joke. The headless chicken tells Peter that Peter has a bad reputation in the chicken community. Not Ernie specifically. The chicken community in general knows who Peter Griffin is and does not think well of him. This suggests that Ernie is not an isolated anomaly. He is part of a broader social structure, a chicken community that exists in Quahog and has formed a collective negative assessment of Peter Griffin based on his behavior toward their kind. Whether that community is aware of the full history of Ernie and Peter's battles, or whether Peter has had additional encounters with chickens that the show has not depicted, is not clear. But the chicken community exists, it has opinions, and it has communicated those opinions to at least one of its members who happened to end up in the same veterinary waiting room as Peter at a moment of crisis. The fights themselves, which become more elaborate and more cinematic with each subsequent installment, also serve an interesting structural function within the show's architecture. They are interruptions. Literal interruptions. A scene is in progress, something is being established or advanced or developed, and then the chicken appears and everything stops while the two of them conduct their war. The episode's actual content is placed on hold. The story pauses. Peter and the chicken consume an enormous amount of screen time, doing something that has no relationship to anything else happening in the episode. And then, when they are finished, the story picks up more or less exactly where it left off. The chicken fights are, in structural terms, the show's most extreme cutaway gag. They are a removal from narrative, rendered at feature-level production quality, fully divorced from the plot, and entirely reliant on the audience's willingness to accept the interruption as its own self-contained spectacle. The fact that they always come out of nowhere, that Peter and Ernie share no dialogue before or after, that there is no building toward them or processing of them, this is not just a comedy choice. It is a mechanical one. The chicken fights exist in their own time, governed by their own rules, disconnected from the cause and effect logic of the surrounding story, which makes Ernie the Giant Chicken, in a strange way, one of the most structurally honest things in the show. He does not pretend to make narrative sense. He does not arrive with an explanation or depart with a consequence. He is pure interruption, pure spectacle, pure commitment to the premise of his own absurdity. And for a show that spent 25 years trying to balance the demands of story with the demands of comedy, often losing that balance to the side of the random gag, there is something almost philosophically clarifying about the giant, immortal chicken who just keeps showing up, ready to fight, carrying a grudge about a piece of paper that expired before Peter could use it. Section 11. The Quagmire Confession and What the Show Knows About Itself. There is one scene in Family Guy's later run that occupies a very specific position in the show's internal mythology. Not because it is the funniest scene, not because it is the best piece of writing, but because it is the moment where the show allowed one of its own characters to say, out loud, The thing that the audience had been thinking for several seasons, and then kept the camera on the character long enough for the implications of what he was saying to become genuinely uncomfortable. The episode is Season 8, Episode 6. Jerome is the New Black. The character speaking is Glenn Quagmire. The target is Brian Griffin. Quagmire does not like Brian. This has been established across multiple episodes. The animosity is particular and personal, and goes beyond the ordinary friction between characters who just do not get along. Quagmire's dislike of Brian is articulate. It is specific. When Peter asks Quagmire why he hates Brian, Quagmire delivers a speech that runs for several minutes and catalogs, with genuine precision, everything that is wrong with Brian Griffin as a person. He calls Brian out for being a phony intellectual who pretends to have read things he has not read, who pretends to hold moral positions that his actual behavior consistently contradicts. He calls Brian out for his pursuit of Lois, ongoing, unsubtle, conducted directly in front of Peter, who is supposed to be Brian's best friend. He calls Brian out for his failed writing career, his pretentious self-image as an artist, his inability to produce anything of actual worth. He mentions that Brian abandoned a teenage son, that Brian gave Stewie herpes, that Brian chased every woman who crossed his path while failing to develop any genuine emotional honesty with any of them. And then he summarizes. Brian is, in Quagmire's assessment, the kind of person who believes himself to be superior while being, by almost every measurable standard, worse. The gap between Brian's self-image and his actual behavior is the thing that Quagmire cannot stand. Not any individual failing, but the consistent falseness of the framing Brian places around his own failings. The speech is remarkably well written. It is, by the show's standards of the time, a piece of unusually committed character work. The writers clearly knew exactly what they were doing. They were putting into Quagmire's mouth the accumulated frustration that viewers had developed about Brian's characterization over the preceding several seasons. They were acknowledging the problem. They were, in the most direct way available to a writer's room, saying, "We know what we have done to this character, and here is a scene where another character says it plainly." And then they changed nothing. The speech delivered, acknowledged, and then completely ignored in terms of its consequences. Brian did not change his behavior after Quagmire laid it out with such specificity. The show did not use the speech as an inflection point toward genuine character development. Quagmire's catalog of grievances was produced, applauded by some portion of the audience, and filed away. Brian remained exactly as he was. This is the most interesting thing about that speech, and the thing that takes it from a funny piece of character work into something stranger. A show that allows one of its characters to deliver a specific, articulate, accurate diagnosis of another character's failures, and then declines to act on that diagnosis, is not just failing to develop its characters. It is demonstrating that it understands its own failures well enough to name them, and has made the active choice to continue failing in the same ways anyway. This pattern repeats across the show's later run in ways that accumulate into a kind of strange reflexivity. Characters make jokes about the show's declining quality. Peter breaks the fourth wall to acknowledge that certain episodes are bad. The show parodies its own reliance on cutaway gags while relying on cutaway gags. Stewie makes knowing remarks about how long the show has been running. The meta-commentary is constant, fluid, and always accompanied by the continuation of the exact behavior being commented on. The show knows what it is doing. It has known for a long time. The Quagmire speech is the clearest single piece of evidence for this, because it demonstrates that the writers had the analytical capacity to identify exactly what had gone wrong with a major character and the verbal capacity to articulate it beautifully. They just declined to fix it. There is something genuinely mysterious about a creative enterprise that reaches this point where the diagnostic capacity and the corrective capacity have fully separated, where the people making the thing are perfectly aware of its problems and have made an accommodation with those problems that allows them to continue. Whether that accommodation is driven by economics, by the path dependency of a long-running show, by the absence of the creator who might have insisted on genuine correction, or by something harder to name, it remains one of the stranger features of Family Guy's later seasons. Quagmire gave the speech. Brian did not change. The show did not change. And somewhere in that gap between diagnosis and treatment, between what the show knows about itself and what it chooses to do with that knowledge, a different kind of mystery lives, not the mystery of an unrevealed secret, but the mystery of a choice that was clearly made and that nobody, including the people who made it, can quite explain. Section 12. The Forgotten Characters and Where They Went. Every long-running show leaves people behind. It is just the nature of the thing. A show runs for 25 years, generating hundreds of episodes, and the cast of characters that lives in its world, the neighbors, the coworkers, the recurring figures who populated the background of the early seasons, cannot all be maintained at consistent frequency forever. The show changes priorities. New characters come in, old characters fade back. Some are written out with ceremony. Many simply stop appearing without explanation. The way real people sometimes drift out of your life without a dramatic departure, just a gradual lessening of presence until one day you realize you have not seen them in years. Family Guy has its roster of the disappeared. Some were casualties of structural changes. In the show, Cleveland Brown was written off to anchor his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013 on Fox. Cleveland's departure from Spooner Street was handled with a proper send-off episode, and his subsequent return after The Cleveland Show ended was handled with similar narrative care. But his years away changed his relationship to the main show's architecture in ways that are never quite articulated. The group that gathered at the Drunken Clam, Peter, Joe, Cleveland, Quagmire, lost a member for 4 full years of the show's run, and the dynamic of that group shifted permanently even after Cleveland came back. Jillian Russell, Brian's girlfriend for a period in the middle seasons, a character voiced by Drew Barrymore, a young woman of extraordinary physical beauty and extraordinary intellectual vacancy who represented an entire chapter of Brian's romantic life, simply vanished. She was a significant presence in Brian's story for a stretch of episodes, and then she was gone. She married someone else within the show. That marriage happened, and then she drifted off the screen and has never fully returned. Given the amount of time the show spent establishing her relationship with Brian, the completeness of her disappearance is one of the show's more jarring examples of a character who was built up and then abandoned without resolution. Angela, Peter's boss at the brewery, was a recurring character for many seasons before her voice actress, Carrie Fisher, passed away in December 2016. The show handled Angela's exit with a degree of care that felt appropriate. She was given an actual death scene in the show, an episode acknowledging her loss, a moment of genuine grief. This is an example of the show doing the responsible thing when the circumstances demanded it, and it stands out partly because it is not how all of the show's departures have been handled. Diane Simmons, one of the original anchors at Quahog 5 News alongside Tom Tucker, was a recurring figure across many seasons before being killed in the Season 9 premiere, and then there were fewer. An episode structured as a murder mystery in which she turns out to be the killer, is shot by Stewie, and dies. The episode is a formal experiment for the show, a full hour-long structured genre piece, and Diane's death is treated with the weight the episode's format demands. But she is also, it should be said, a character who existed for many seasons as a comic supporting figure, and whose departure involved being revealed as a killer and then shot by a baby. The resolution to her character arc is both dramatically interesting and, from the perspective of someone who had watched her play comedy for years, somewhat at odds with who she had been. Mr. Weed, Peter's boss at the happy-go-lucky toy factory in the earliest seasons of the show, dies in the episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein by choking on a dinner roll while dining with Peter and Lois. The choking scene is played for dark comedy. Mr. Weed dies. The factory subsequently closes. Peter loses his job and eventually lands at the brewery. This is one of the few major life changes in the show's history that has actually stuck. Peter has worked at the brewery ever since Mr. Weed's death, and the toy factory has never returned. Mr. Weed's death, comedic as it was, had lasting structural consequences in the show's world that very few other deaths have managed. There is also the category of characters whose disappearance is stranger because it is never addressed. Characters who were in multiple episodes across multiple seasons, who existed in the fabric of the show with enough regularity to feel settled, and who then simply stopped appearing with no goodbye and no explanation. The greased-up deaf guy, a recurring figure in various Quahog civic events. Neil Goldman, Meg's devoted would-be suitor at school, whose appearances became less frequent and eventually almost non-existent as the show moved through its later seasons. Connie D'Amico, Meg's primary antagonist at school, whose cruelty toward Meg was a consistent through-line until the show's treatment of Meg shifted, and Connie became unnecessary to the story being told. These characters did not die. They did not leave town. They were not written out with any ceremony. They simply stopped being needed by the stories being told, and the show's world quietly closed around their absence the way water closes around a hand that has been removed from it. Within the show's fiction, they are presumably still there. Neil is still somewhere in Quahog, probably still carrying feelings for Meg that will never be resolved, probably still existing in the same high school ecosystem that the show occasionally remembers and occasionally forgets. But they do not appear. They are there and not there simultaneously, present in the world's implied architecture and absent from its actual depiction. There is something worth sitting with in the accumulation of these absences. Family Guy at its height in those first few seasons, when the show felt like a living community had a texture to it that came from exactly these secondary and tertiary characters. The feeling of a real place came from the fact that the Griffins were not alone in a void. They existed in a neighborhood, a town, a web of relationships that extended beyond the immediate family. Neil Goldman's persistent, awkward devotion to Meg gave Meg a relationship that was hers alone. Gillian gave Brian a romantic chapter that illuminated specific things about his character. Connie D'Amico gave the high school sequences a social architecture that made Meg's isolation feel specific and real, rather than abstract. When those characters faded, they took their pieces of the world with them. The Quahog that remains in the show's later seasons is a leaner place, a place where fewer people occupy specific and consistent relationships with the main characters. The show got smaller in a very specific way, not in production quality, which has generally held up, but in the density of its social world. The town that once felt populated began to feel like a set with fewer extras. The forgotten characters are the ones who made the place feel real. Their absence is one of the more quietly devastating mysteries in the show's long history, not because we do not know what happened to them, but because we know exactly what happened to them. The story stopped needing them, and in a world that only exists within its story, that is the same thing as ceasing to exist at all. Section 13. The theory that ties it all together. Everything we have covered tonight, the impossible geography of the town, the question of who hears Stewie and what that means, the paradox hidden in Brian's death and resurrection, the multiverse and all its implications, the missing history of Meg's real father, the void at the center of Peter's origins, the darkness in Lois's past, the indifferent cosmology of heaven and death, the immortal chicken and his endless war, the moment the show diagnosed its own failure without treating it, the quiet vanishing of all the people who used to make the world feel real. All of these mysteries share a certain quality. They are all mysteries about the stability of reality, about whether what we are watching holds together as a consistent world, or whether it is something built on a foundation that was always, from the very beginning, more provisional than the comfortable theme song and the familiar opening credits would suggest. Whether the characters who live in this story know something about the nature of their own existence, whether Stewie's compulsive need to build escape mechanisms reflects, on some deep structural level, an awareness of the fragility of the world he lives in, whether Brian's atheism, his persistent belief that there is nothing beyond the world he can see, is a response to the specific kind of cosmological vacuum that actually surrounds him. Whether Meg's perpetual sense of being unseen, unheard, unacknowledged reflects something real about her position in a story that kept trying to write her as absence. The fan theory that Quahog is a purgatory is popular not because it is provably true within the show's text, but because it is a frame that makes the evidence make sense. A place outside normal time and space, characters who do not reliably die, a geography that reshapes itself around narrative need, a population that cannot remember its own past with consistency, a history that contradicts itself, a world that absorbs catastrophe without accumulating consequence. The theory that the show is told from Stewie's perspective is popular for the same reason it provides a frame for the inconsistencies that is more emotionally coherent than just calling them mistakes. The cutaways as hallucinations, the adults as projections, Brian as the one relationship that escapes the projection because dogs are always real in the way that grown-ups sometimes are not. Neither theory needs to be literally true to be useful. What they are doing is pointing at something real about the show, that the world of Family Guy was always a stranger and more fragile construction than it appeared to be, that the comfort it projected was always built on ground that shifted if you pressed it, and that the mysteries it accumulated across 25 years are not bugs in the system, but features of it. A show about a dysfunctional family in an impossible town that slowly hollowed itself out across its own long run, losing its characters to distortion and its stories to habit, and its heart to the machinery of its own continuation, this is the kind of show that would generate exactly these kinds of mysteries. The gaps in the narrative are the gaps in the family. The inconsistencies in the geography mirror the inconsistencies in who these people are supposed to be. The immortal chicken and the dead dog and the missing father and the undeliverable zip code are all different shapes of the same fundamental strangeness. Something was built here, in the late 1990s, by a young animator named Seth MacFarlane, who had been working at a studio drawing cartoons for other people's shows. He built something that people fell in love with fast and hard enough to bring it back from cancellation twice. He built characters who felt real and a town that felt lived in, and a family that felt genuinely complicated in ways that good families are complicated. And then the building kept building, past the point of its own plans, past the point where anyone was sure where the walls were supposed to go, adding rooms that opened onto other rooms that did not quite connect, accumulating detail and contradiction and mystery in the way that old buildings do when they have been lived in too long by too many people for anyone to maintain a complete record of what was added when and why. The resulting structure is not exactly coherent, but it is endlessly interesting. The corridors lead to places you did not expect. The rooms contain things that should not be there. The geography does not resolve. The lights are on in windows that have no apparent interior. And somewhere in the heart of it, in a yellow shirt, in a room full of weapons and plans and schemes that may or may not exist outside a baby's imagination, someone is waiting for you to press the right button and see what actually happens. Family Guy is a mystery that has been running for 25 years and has not finished surprising the people who pay attention to it. The laugh track is there to reassure you. The familiar characters are there to comfort you. The theme song is there to settle you back into the feeling that everything is fine. But the geography is impossible. The timeline is fractured. The town is built on a name that belongs to the family at its center. The dog who died came back from a different branch of causality. The chicken cannot die. The baby might be the only one who is really there. And nobody, in 25 years of telling this story, has quite explained what any of that means. Closing the long quiet. That is where we leave it tonight. Not with answers, because the answers are not the point. The questions are the point. The long, comfortable uncertainty of lying in the dark and turning these things over the geography that will not stay still. The characters who keep shape-shifting away from who they were at the beginning. The town that was founded by a griffin and still bends around a griffin. The multiverse humming quietly beneath every episode with all its infinite variations of every story that was ever told here. Family Guy has been running since 1999. Hundreds of episodes. Millions of viewers. Declining now from what they once were, but still real. Still out there watching on Wednesday nights, or catching up on streaming at midnight. A world that has been visited more often than almost any other animated world in television history. And in all those visits, all those episodes, all that accumulated time in the company of these characters, the show has quietly generated one of the richest collections of unresolved mysteries in animated television. Not because the writers intended all of them. Not because there is a grand theory sitting somewhere in a production document that explains what Stan Thompson's last name is supposed to signify, or whether Brian actually retained any memories of the timeline he came back from. But because that is what happens when you tell enough stories about the same people in the same place across enough time. The gaps accumulate. The contradictions develop texture. The silences start to sound like something. Quahog, Rhode Island. A town that should not exist. Full of people who should not be the way they are, telling stories that keep contradicting themselves in ways that somehow add up to something. Something strange and warm and occasionally deeply unsettling. The way a house you grew up in can be both completely familiar and quietly full of things you never looked at closely enough. Settle in. Let it get quiet. Let the questions sit with you in the dark, turning slowly, the way all good mysteries do when you stop trying to solve them and just let yourself wonder instead. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you made it this far, if these mysteries have been good company on a quiet night wherever you are, the subscribe button is always there. These videos only happen because the people who find them decide to stay around for the next one. More questions are coming. More quiet corridors. More lights on in windows that should not have rooms behind them. Sleep well. Script for Uncle Guy Lore. All content original. For 11 Labs voiceover generation. Section 3 extended. The voices Stewie heard, and the ones he didn't. There is something worth dwelling on a little longer when it comes to the Stewie problem, because the question of who can hear him is really just the surface layer of something much more unsettling once you commit to examining it. Consider what it actually means to be Stewie Griffin. You are 1 year old. Your body is the body of an infant. You cannot walk with full confidence. You cannot feed yourself. You cannot operate a door handle or reach a countertop or perform any of the 1,000 ordinary physical functions that adults perform without thought. Your physical reality is one of complete dependence. Every basic need you have is met by someone else, on their schedule, according to their interpretation of what you need. But your mind is something different. Your mind contains sophistication, strategic planning, an engineering vocabulary, a working knowledge of theoretical physics, a refined aesthetic sensibility, a genuine creative intelligence, and a will that is as strong and as directed as any adult's will. You have plans, actual plans, with blueprints, with timelines, with contingencies. You have opinions about literature and music and the proper temperature for a martini. You have feelings about your mother that are extremely specific and extremely complicated, and that you have processed and articulated and acted upon with a consistency that suggests genuine emotional investment rather than casual frustration. You have all of this, and you are 1 year old, and the people around you largely cannot hear you, or perhaps more accurately, will not hear you, because the distinction matters enormously when you are living inside it. The difference between cannot and will not is the difference between being imprisoned in silence and being disregarded. Being imprisoned in silence is terrible, but it is impersonal. You are not responsible for the wall, and the wall does not imply anything about your worth. Being disregarded is different. Being disregarded means the thing you are saying has been registered and set aside, which is a judgment. Being disregarded means the people around you have decided, explicitly or through accumulated habit, that what you are communicating does not warrant engagement. Stewie has spent his entire depicted existence in a condition that might be either of these things, and he genuinely does not always know which. Sometimes he speaks and Peter actually responds, with content-specific acknowledgement, and in those moments the world feels real in a particular way, the way any relationship feels real when it proves reciprocal. But then the next episode Peter cannot hear him again, or ignores him again, and the ambiguity returns. Was the earlier moment of comprehension real? Was this a genuine connection that then disappeared? Or was it always a misreading Stewie interpreting a contextual coincidence as comprehension, the way you might interpret a stranger's smile as being directed at you when it was actually directed at something behind you? This is the existential condition that the show has placed Stewie in, and that it has maintained for 25 years without resolution. Not the comedy condition, the genuinely strange and uncomfortable philosophical condition. A person of enormous intelligence living inside a body that everyone else interprets as an infant, in a social environment that operates on the assumption that what he is saying does not warrant engagement, unable to fully determine from the inside whether the assumption is correct or not. The weapons and the plans and the world domination schemes have a function in this context that goes beyond comedy. They are proof. They are the evidence that Stewie produces for himself that he is what he believes himself to be, that he is not a baby whose babbling sounds like elaborate monologues only to himself, but an actual, sophisticated intelligence whose capabilities can be demonstrated in concrete and material form. You cannot argue with a working time machine. You cannot dismiss the evidence of a functional mind control device that works exactly as its blueprint specified. The schemes are not just jokes about a baby wanting to take over the world. They are the work Stewie does to maintain his belief in his own reality against an environment that keeps behaving as though that reality does not exist. Brian matters so much to Stewie, and their friendship became genuinely one of the most moving elements of the entire show because Brian is consistent. Brian always hears him. Brian always responds to the content of what Stewie says rather than to the presumed need behind it. With Brian, Stewie never has to wonder. He knows he is being heard. He knows the person across from him is engaging with his actual intelligence rather than with his inferred infant needs. For a person living in Stewie's particular epistemic uncertainty, always on the edge of genuine comprehension and genuine invisibility, this consistency is not just companionship. It is the foundational relationship that allows any of the rest of the world to feel navigable. It is, in the most specific emotional sense available, safety. And this is why Brian's death landed with such extraordinary weight in that November 2013 episode. Not because a fan-favorite character died, though that was real, Not because the scene was written with uncommon care, though it was, but because the show, in killing Brian, temporarily removed the one consistent point of reference that Stewie had for his own existence. The one person who always, reliably, without exception or condition, confirmed that Stewie was real, that what he said mattered, that his intelligence was not a hallucination he was sustaining against all evidence. With Brian gone, Stewie was alone in his epistemic uncertainty in a way he had not been since very early childhood. The replacement dog, Vinny, could understand him. The show established this, but Vinny's comprehension was new, untested, without the long history of consistency that gave Brian's comprehension its weight. You can be heard by someone new and not feel heard, because feeling heard is not just about the exchange of information. It is about the accumulated weight of knowing that this person will hear you again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Stewie's grief in those 3 episodes was specific grief. Not just the loss of a friend, the loss of the one person who made the world feel stable from inside. Which makes the causal paradox at the center of Brian's return even more interesting. Stewie was motivated to recover the time travel pad by his grief. His grief was real and extreme, and produced the specific quality of attention that allowed him to notice the past version of himself in the mall and recognize the opportunity. Without the grief, without the 3 episodes of raw loss, the reunion with the past self would not have produced the recognition. The grief was the lens through which the opportunity became visible. Brian came back because Stewie loved him. The mechanism was a time travel pad and a causal loop. But the engine was grief, and the grief was what it was because of what Brian had been the consistent confirmation of Stewie's reality in a world that kept making him uncertain of it. None of this is in the show, none of it is stated. But it is all implied by what the show has established about these 2 characters across years of telling their story together. And lying in the dark and turning it over, the weight of it is something you can feel without anyone having to explain it to you. Section 4 Extended. The timeline fractures and what they left behind. Brian's death and resurrection is the most discussed example of Family Guy's time travel consequences. But it is not the only one, and the others accumulate into a picture of a fictional timeline that has been substantially altered from whatever its original form was by decades of time travel interference. The most systematic offender is obviously Stewie himself. His time machine, used across dozens of episodes across many seasons, has altered the past on multiple documented occasions, each alteration producing a ripple effect in the present that the show sometimes acknowledges and usually does not. Every time Stewie traveled to the past and made a change intentional or accidental, a new branch of the timeline was generated. The show's treatment of these branches varies from episode to episode. Sometimes the alterations are treated as serious and requiring correction. Sometimes they produce a new version of the present that is simply accepted as the new normal. Sometimes they are undone by subsequent episodes. The overall picture of the Family Guy timeline, viewed across its entire run, is one of a past that has been repeatedly and incompletely modified by a baby with excellent engineering skills and an inconsistent relationship with the concept of consequences. The Meet the Quagmires episode, in which Brian and Peter travel to the 1980s and Peter's interference nearly results in him not marrying Lois, is an example of the show treating timeline alteration as a serious threat requiring urgent correction. Peter returns to the present to find it substantially changed. Lois married, Quagmire, Cleveland became a famous rapper. Various other elements of the primary timeline have been modified. The episode's resolution involves returning to the past and undoing the changes, restoring the original configuration, mostly. The accidental punch that Peter throws at young Ernie the chicken during the resolution produces a secondary consequence that the episode treats as comedic rather than seriously consequential, establishing the origin of a feud while appearing to solve the primary problem. But mostly is the operative word in every time travel resolution Family Guy has ever produced. The restorations are always mostly complete. The corrections are always mostly thorough. There is always a residue, always some secondary consequence that was not fully addressed, always some element of the altered timeline that got carried forward into the restored version, because the show needed a joke, or because the writers did not fully account for all the implications. Consider the Back to the Pilot episode, in which Brian and Stewie travel back to the first episode of the show. The premise is partly self-referential comedy, watching the characters interact with their past selves from 20 seasons ago, noticing the animation differences, making jokes about how much has changed. But embedded in the episode is a genuine engagement with the nature of time travel consequences. The Brian and Stewie who observe the first episode observe it from a position of knowledge of everything that happened between then and now, and the episode allows them to acknowledge, briefly and with genuine weight, that if they could change things they saw in that first episode, they would be changing the entire history of the world they know. They do not change things. They return to their own time without substantial alteration. But the episode establishes that the awareness of what could be changed is there, that the technology to change it is available, and that the reason they do not is not an inability but a choice or, in some cases, a near miss. How many near misses are in the show's timeline history? How many moments when Stewie's interference almost produced an unrecoverable alteration, was corrected at the last possible moment, but left a small residue that was incorporated into the restored timeline as a new normal? The show does not maintain a running total of these. It cannot, by its own structural nature. Each episode is largely self-contained, and the running total of temporal modifications would require a level of continuity tracking that the show has never been interested in. But the implication is that the timeline the show currently occupies is not the original timeline. It is a patchwork, a version of the original timeline that has been modified, corrected, nearly corrupted, partially restored, and modified again, so many times across so many episodes that the original version may now be functionally unrecoverable. The Griffin family that exists in the show's current episodes may not be the Griffin family that would have existed had Stewie never built his time machine. The small changes, the dozens of minor alterations that were treated as jokes and not corrected, the near misses that produced residues that were absorbed into the new normal, the secondary consequences of corrections that address the primary problem, but not the full system, all of these compose a palimpsest. The current timeline written over layers of previous timelines, each previous layer leaving traces in the current one that are not always legible but that are always present. In a show that is ostensibly about a family in Rhode Island going about their lives in an animated world, this is a genuinely strange thing to have built. The family does not know this about themselves. They do not experience their timeline as a palimpsest. To them, their history is simply their history. Peter was born in Mexico, raised by Francis, found out about Mickey, met Lois, they had Meg and Chris and Stewie. Brian has always been here. The world is what it is. But the world is what Stewie's time machine made it. And Stewie built that machine in his crib, and aimed it at the past, and used it dozens of times, and the version of the present that resulted from all of those uses is the one everyone is living in now, including Stewie himself. Section 5 extended. What the alternate universes say about the primary one. The multiverse episode established something that requires follow-through thought, which is that every version of the Family Guy world that was visited in that episode was presented as equally real, not as a dream Stewie was having, not as a hypothetical scenario, as an actual parallel universe that actually exists, fully populated, with its own history and its own inhabitants going about their own version of the story. The Disney universe deserves particular attention in this context. Because of all the universes visited in the episode, it is the one that engages most directly with the question of what the Family Guy world actually is. In the Disney universe, everything is rendered in the visual vocabulary of classic Disney animation: clean lines, warm colors, fluid movement, the musical sensibility of the golden age of the animated musical. The characters are recognizable but transformed. They are drawn in the way that Disney characters are drawn, which means they are drawn in the way that was designed to generate immediate emotional warmth and trust and investment in the viewer. The song the episode uses, "It's a Wonderful Day for Pie," is gorgeous. It is not a parody of a Disney song. It is an actual Disney song, produced with the full seriousness of the form, capturing the specific quality of musical warmth that classic Disney was built on. Watching it in the context of a Family Guy episode, in a universe that is being presented as parallel to the primary universe rather than as a fantasy within it, produces a specific and interesting effect. The primary universe's Family Guy is rough, dark, cruel in places, warm only when it chooses to be and often not choosing to be. The Disney universe version of the same world is soft, beautiful, warm as a default, organized around the assumption that the world is fundamentally kind and that the people in it deserve to feel that kindness. Same characters, same town, same basic family structure, but the emotional temperature of the world they inhabit is completely different. Both universes are equally real within the multiverse. Both are happening simultaneously. And the gap between them is not a gap in quality. The Disney universe is not presented as better than the primary universe, nor the primary universe as better. They are just different versions of the same possibility space. Different choices made at some fork in the history of this world, choices that resulted in the world having a different fundamental quality. This is, if you let it, a genuinely moving thing to sit with. Somewhere in the multiverse that the show established, the Griffin family lives in a version of their world where the fundamental emotional temperature is warm, where the music is lovely and the colors are soft, and the relationships are organized around joy rather than around the dysfunction and cruelty that the primary timeline has accumulated. They are the same people. They have the same names and the same faces and the same family relationships, but they live in a world that treats them with the gentleness the Disney aesthetic implies. That world is as real as this one. It is happening right now, in the infinite parallel structure of the Family Guy multiverse. Meg Griffin, in that universe, lives in a world that is warm toward her as a default. Not because her family suddenly became perfect even in the Disney universe. The family dynamics are likely recognizable, the imperfections still present in some form. But because the world itself is organized around warmth, and Meg is a person in that world, and the world's warmth extends to her the way it extends to everyone, this is the implication that Road to the Multiverse planted and never revisited. The show looked at its own primary universe, and it looked at an alternative version of that universe where everything was beautiful, and it made a comedic bit out of the contrast, and then it moved on. But the contrast remains. It was established as real. And in the quiet of a late night, the question of why the show kept choosing to tell the story of the primary universe rather than that one is not a theoretical question. It is a genuine puzzle about the nature of what this show decided it was going to be. Section 6, Extended. The weight of Meg's headphones. We have talked about what Meg did not hear in that courtroom. The two words spoken in her presence, directed past her headphones into the room's air, received by everyone in the scene except the one person they most directly concerned. But there is a second layer to the Meg Griffin mystery that does not get the attention it deserves, and it has to do not with who her father is, but with what her experience of her own family has made her. The show spent roughly 10 seasons from around season 4 through season 14, give or take using Meg as a designated target. The mechanics of this are well documented in the transcript we started with. Her appearance became the source of jokes. Her family treated her with escalating contempt. The outside world closed ranks against her in ways that went beyond ordinary teenage social difficulty into something that the show itself eventually had one episode acknowledge was actively harmful. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode, in which Meg finally confronts her family, delivers a speech that lands every point correctly. She is right about what has been done to her. The speech is accurate. And the episode ends with her taking it all back, accepting her role, returning to her position as the household's absorber of everyone else's dysfunction. The show's defenders have argued that the episode was meta-commentary, that Meg's choice to return to her role was the show acknowledging the absurdity of that role while also being unable to change it for structural reasons. The show needs a punching bag. Meg is the punching bag. The episode is the show being honest about this rather than pretending otherwise. That reading is available. But there is another reading, one that lands with considerably more discomfort, and it goes like this. The episode is not meta-commentary. The episode is depicting something real about the dynamic of families in which one member has been designated as the repository for everyone else's unprocessed feelings. In such families, and they exist, in reality, with painful regularity, the designated member often does exactly what Meg does at the end of that episode. They return to their role. Not because they agree it is fair, not because they do not feel the injustice of it, but because the cost of refusing to return is too high. The family cannot function without the designated absorber. If the absorber stops absorbing, the dysfunction redistributes to everyone and everything falls apart. The absorber knows this. And they choose over and over again to pay the cost themselves rather than impose it on the rest of the family. This is not a fictional dynamic. This is a documented feature of real family systems that produce serious psychological harm to the designated absorber over time. The therapeutic term for what Meg is doing when she takes it all back is accommodation. She is accommodating her family's need to externalize their dysfunction because the alternative, requiring them to hold their own dysfunction internally, would destroy the family structure she has been embedded in her whole life, and that, for all its cruelty toward her, is the only family she has. The show played this for comedy or tried to. The audience largely did not find it funny, which is why that episode is consistently cited as one of the most hated in the show's run. Not because it was poorly made, but because the thing it depicted was too recognizable, too close to something real, too clearly connected to patterns of harm that real people experience in real families for the comedic framing to fully work. Meg Griffin is the most human character in the show, not in spite of her suffering but because of how she handles it. She absorbs it, she accommodates it, she takes it back. She puts on her headphones and she is present in the room where the truth about her is being spoken, and she does not hear it. Not because the show made her wear headphones at that moment as a convenient narrative device, but because people in Meg's position learn, over time, to be present in rooms where important things are happening, while remaining sufficiently insulated from those things to survive the experience. The headphones are not just a plotting convenience. They are a character portrait. They are the show accidentally or perhaps not accidentally capturing something true about what it looks like to be the person who absorbs everyone else's pain, the specific quality of protective withdrawal that such people develop, the way they can be completely present and completely sealed off at the same time. Stan Thompson's name floated in the courtroom air. Meg's headphones kept the air out. She sat there, present and absent, the mystery of her own origins spoken in the room while she listened to whatever she had chosen to listen to instead. Section 7 extended. The brewery and the man who survived it. Peter Griffin's employment history is one of the show's more consistent through lines. Consistent not in the sense that it is stable, but in the sense that its instabilities follow a recognizable pattern. He has held multiple jobs across the show's run, each one establishing something about who he is and how he moves through the working world, and each one ending in a manner that reflects the particular chaos that Peter brings to any structured system. The Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory was his primary employer for the show's first several seasons. He worked there as a safety inspector, a role whose irony the show exploited consistently and effectively. Peter Griffin as a safety inspector is someone whose presence in that role produces the opposite of what the role is designed to produce, a fact that the show made explicit on multiple occasions. His boss, Mr. Weed, was a reasonable man doing his best to run a reasonable business, and Peter's impact on both the business and the reasonableness was consistently negative in ways that Mr. Weed absorbed with the patient resignation of someone who has simply accepted that this is how things are. Then Mr. Weed choked on a dinner roll and died. The factory closed. Peter found himself unemployed. The transition from the toy factory to the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery was handled with less ceremony than the weight of the transition warranted. The brewery became the occupational backdrop for essentially all of the show's subsequent run, well over 2 decades of episodes, in which Peter's workplace context was the brewery, the Pawtucket Patriot brand, and the shipping department in which he worked with enough competence to hold the job while making enough of an impact to generate regular storyline material. The brewery also became the vehicle for what is arguably the show's most sustained piece of product integration, Pawtucket Patriot Ale, the fictional beer brand, becoming as embedded in the show's identity as any of its actual characters. Peter drinks it. He promotes it, sometimes sincerely and sometimes inadvertently, and sometimes against his employer's interests. It appears in the background of The Drunken Clam. It exists in the world of the show with the kind of casual omnipresence that real brands have in real lives, which is an interesting thing for a fictional brand to achieve. The brewery itself was the setting for a variety of episodic storylines across the show's long middle run, and in those storylines the show established a workplace community. Angela, as Peter's boss, various co-workers including a cast of background characters who were given names and occasional dialogue that functioned as a secondary social world for Peter alongside his neighborhood friendships. Like the neighborhood, this workplace community thinned over time. Angela died when her voice actress passed away. The co-workers became less specific. The brewery remained as a setting but became less populated as a community. What the brewery represents in the show's larger mystery architecture is something worth noting. It is the place that exists because a man died choking on a dinner roll. It is the permanent consequence of an impermanent seeming moment. Every episode set in Peter's workplace, every Pawtucket Patriot Ale joke, every brewing-related plot point for the past 20 years exists because of a specific death on a specific evening. A death that was played for dark comedy and then carried forward as a structural consequence. In a show that has struggled to let events have lasting consequences, The Brewery is an anomaly. It is the show's most successful example of a consequence that stuck. And the fact that it stuck because of a death, rather than because of anything Peter did. The brewery is not something Peter created, not something he earned, not something he chose as its own piece of the show's larger pattern. The things in Peter's life that are most stable are the things that came to him. The brewery arrived because someone died. The house on Spooner Street was always already there. The family was built around him more than by him. The town was founded by his ancestor for his eventual use. Peter Griffin occupies the center of this story, the way that certain people occupy the centers of their lives, not by building or choosing or earning, but by being there, by being present at the center of what was already organized around him. The world of Family Guy arranged itself around Peter Griffin the way the town of Quahog arranged itself around the Griffin family, because that is what it was built to do, and it does it whether anyone asks it to or not. Section 8 Extended. Lois and what the wealth actually meant. The Pewterschmidt family is one of the show's most sustained background mysteries, in the sense that the family has been depicted across dozens of episodes with enough detail to generate genuine questions about what it actually was like to grow up inside it, and yet the show has never brought those questions to the surface with full seriousness. Carter Pewterschmidt's documented behavior across the show's run includes actively attempting to destroy his daughter's marriage on multiple occasions, conducting an extramarital affair that Barbara discovered and that temporarily ended their marriage, being caught in at least one additional affair by Peter, maintaining a systematic effort to undermine Peter's confidence and social standing in ways that go well beyond casual father-in-law friction, suppressing the existence of his institutionalized son Patrick for years and deceiving his entire family about Patrick's existence, and what appears to be in one brief and quickly passed over scene a hint about his behavior toward Lois that is dark enough that the show chose not to develop it. This is not a picture of a difficult man. This is a picture of a controlling man, a man who organizes the world around his own convenience and who applies significant resources, financial, social, relational, to maintaining the configuration he wants. The disappearance of Patrick Pewterschmidt is the clearest example of this. A grown man, the eldest child of the family, erased from the family narrative because his mental illness and its consequences were an inconvenience to the image Carter wanted to maintain. Lois did not know her own brother existed because her father decided his existence was not information she needed. What does it do to a person, growing up with a father like that? What does it do to your relationship with your own history, with your own past, with the information you think you have about where you come from? Lois grew up in a household where the official record of her own family was actively managed by a man with the power and the will to manage it. She accepted the family she was given because she was never given a reason to question whether the family she was given was the complete one. She found out about Patrick only by accident, by looking too carefully at a photograph, by noticing an absence in the image that had been arranged to contain no such absence. The truth about her family was discoverable, but it required a particular kind of attention that she had not known to bring to the picture because she had not known there was anything to look for. This pattern truth available, but requiring specific attention to find, official record incomplete and managed, history shaped by the decisions of a controlling patriarch, is also the pattern of the Stan Thompson revelation. The truth about Meg's parentage was spoken in a room Meg was in, but managing access to that truth required no active effort by anyone. Meg simply did not hear it. The headphones she chose to wear provided the insulation that Carter had to work harder to provide for himself. There is something deeply unsettling about the parallel. Carter managed information actively hiring, firing, institutionalizing, erasing. Lois's family history was shaped by his management, and she had to discover the gaps accidentally. Meg's true origin was managed passively. The truth was in the room, unprotected, available, and Meg simply did not receive it because the conditions happened to prevent her from hearing it. No one erased it. No one managed it. It was just said at the wrong moment, in the wrong direction, with the wrong audiological conditions. Carter worked very hard to keep Patrick out of Lois's knowledge. Nobody worked at all to keep Stan Thompson out of Meg's knowledge. And both women ended up in the same position, not knowing something fundamental about their own family. The active suppression and the passive miss produced the same outcome. What this suggests about the Griffin family's relationship with truth, with the complete facts of their own histories, with the unmanaged record of who they actually are and where they actually came from, is that the truth has always been more available than anyone has made use of. The information exists. It is in courtroom records and family photographs and late-night conversations with a dog who always listens. Nobody is systematically suppressing it at this point. The people who hold it just have not found the right moment, or the right audience, or the right conditions for it to land where it could actually do something. Lois keeps her history in the same way she keeps everything she is careful with, accessible to those she chooses to make it accessible to, visible only to those who are paying the specific kind of attention that reveals it. Brian knows more of it than Peter does, perhaps more of it than anyone else in the household. He is the one she talks to at night. He is the one who always hears everything. And Brian came back from the dead and carries no memory of whatever he briefly experienced and the conversations he and Lois had before November 24th, 2013 are intact in his memory. But the event of his death is not. The Brian who knows Lois's history is the same Brian who died and came back. His knowledge survived the death and the return. But his experience of what the death was, of what Lois's face looked like when she said goodbye to him, of what it was like to feel that particular grief focused on him, of whatever the other side of that moment contained, that is gone. Reset, not available to the version of Brian who is currently drinking Lois's cooking sherry and reading unfinished manuscript pages in the living room. The history is there, the knowledge is there, the connections that make the knowledge meaningful are intact, but the weight of what those connections survived, the weight that would make all of it more important, more present, more impossible to set aside, that weight was reset when Stewie went back for him. Brian remembers everything he knew before he died. He has no idea what he went through to get back. Section 9 Extended. The cosmology and the characters who navigate it. The God of Family Guy has, across multiple episodes, been depicted doing something interesting that has not received much analysis. He has made decisions that turned out to be wrong, and he has had to deal with the consequences of those decisions. This is unusual for a comedically depicted God. The standard comedic approach to a divine character is to make the character either omnipotent and therefore unable to be interestingly wrong, or impotent and therefore only capable of being interestingly helpless. Family Guy's God is neither of these. He is powerful enough to shape events and weak enough to misjudge them. He has preferences, and those preferences do not always lead to good outcomes. He makes deals that then need to be renegotiated. In one of the more sustained engagements with God as a character, the storyline in which Peter discovers his guardian angel, the storyline in which the show briefly engaged with the question of what divine protection actually means, in a world that generates the amount of suffering, the Family Guy world does the show demonstrated an awareness of what it had built. It knew its cosmology was strange. It knew the combination of real divine entities with the relentless bleakness of some of the show's content was an uncomfortable combination. And it handled that discomfort by making the divine characters self-aware about the discomfort too. God in Family Guy is a God who knows that the world he is responsible for does not always reflect well on the quality of his supervision. The joke is usually at God's expense. He is caught in an awkward position, trying to explain outcomes that do not fit the narrative of benevolent cosmic management. But the jokes also reveal something true about the cosmology. This is a God who could intervene more than he does and does not. This is a God who watches the things that happen to the Griffin family, the sustained cruelty toward Meg, the exploitation of Brian's death for ratings, the accumulated petty sufferings of an ordinary Rhode Island household, and who intervenes occasionally but not systematically, and who does not appear to find the experience of watching all of this comfortable. In a universe where God is real and present and available, the question of why things are the way they are becomes specific and pointed, not a theological abstraction. Not why does God allow suffering as a philosophical puzzle. The actual question, why does this specific God, who has been shown to be accessible and capable of intervention, allow the specific things that happen in this specific show to keep happening? The show never answers this, because the show is a comedy and not a theodicy. But the question sits inside its own cosmology, generated by the combination of things the show chose to be. A world with a real and accessible God. A world in which the things done to the weakest characters, Meg primarily, across those 10 seasons were genuinely distressing. A world in which that combination was simply allowed to coexist. Perhaps the answer is this. God in Family Guy is real and present and capable and watches the same things the audience watches. And he does exactly what the audience does. He stays in his seat, He does not intervene. He watches the family do what families do, and sometimes he makes a small thing easier, and sometimes he looks away. And when you ask him why, his answer is probably not very different from the answer the writers would give if you asked them the same question. Because that is how the story goes. Because some version of this had to happen for the rest of the story to be possible. Because the show has to keep going, and the people who make it have to keep making it, and the God who watches over it has to keep watching over it, and the only thing anyone can do with that fact is decide how much of it to let trouble you. Section 10 Extended. The Chicken, Part 2, The Wound That Keeps Reopening. There is something in the structure of the chicken fights themselves that reveals what they are really about, and it has nothing to do with an expired coupon. The fights are interruptions. This is their structural function. Every single one happens the same way. The episode's narrative is underway, something is developing, something is being established or resolved or complicated, and then Ernie appears, and everything stops. The narrative halts. The story that was developing disappears. All attention is absorbed by the fight, which has no connection to the narrative it interrupted, which cannot advance any plot or develop any character or contribute to any theme the episode was exploring. When the fight ends, the narrative resumes. The story picks up from where it stopped. Whatever was happening before continues as though the interruption never happened. Sometimes the interruption has caused physical damage to the environment, buildings destroyed, vehicles wrecked that is acknowledged in the aftermath. But the narrative itself, the thing that was interrupted, never acknowledges the interruption. It just continues. This is the strange quality of the chicken fights that goes unnoticed precisely because you are always laughing at them or absorbing the spectacle of them rather than noticing what they are doing. They are the show demonstrating, in the most literal possible way, that its own narrative is interruptible, that whatever is happening in the story can be stopped completely at any moment by something that has absolutely nothing to do with it. That the cause and effect structure of the story is not robust, it can be suspended indefinitely, for any reason, and then resumed without the suspension having mattered. In a show that already has a tendency toward cutaway gags, toward interrupting its own stories with random jokes, the chicken fights are the extreme version of the same impulse. They are the most extravagant possible expression of the show's conviction that its own stories do not matter enough to protect from interruption. The story stops for Ernie the same way the story stops for a 30-second cutaway about something Peter saw on television in 1984. The principle is identical. The production value of the interruption is much higher. But the underlying attitude toward the story being interrupted is exactly the same. And Ernie always gets up. He always gets up after Peter leaves. The next fight is always coming. The interruption cannot be defeated. You can win every single fight, Peter does win every single fight, by every conventional measure of winning, and the thing you fought still gets up and is still there, and the next fight is still coming. This is the show's most honest self-portrait. The story of the Griffins, whatever it is at any given moment, will always be interrupted. The interruptions cannot be permanently defeated. They survive every apparent victory and return with the same energy they always had. The narrative resumes after each one, but the next one is already on its way. Ernie is the show's relationship to its own content, given a face and a name, and an expired coupon. Section 11. Extended. What the show knows it is. The Quagmire speech is the most direct version of something that runs through the show's later seasons as a kind of ambient self-awareness, but it is worth looking at the specific ways the show has expressed this awareness across different contexts, because the accumulation of those expressions tells a more complete story. The fourth wall breaking in Family Guy's later seasons is constant, and it takes a specific form that distinguishes it from the fourth wall breaking in shows that use the technique to different ends. In Family Guy, the fourth wall breaks are almost always about failure. Characters acknowledge the show's declining quality, the length of its run, the gap between what it used to be and what it is. Peter speaks to the camera about the fact that the show has been on too long. Stewie makes jokes about whether the writing is good enough. The characters occasionally perform what amounts to a formal acknowledgement that the thing they are in is not as good as the thing it used to be. This is not self-deprecation for its own sake. Self-deprecation performed consistently over many years and many episodes, without any corresponding correction, becomes something else. It becomes a record. The show's fourth wall breaking constitutes a documented acknowledgement, episode after episode, that the people making the show knew what the show was doing and chose to continue. Not through ignorance. not through self-deception, with full awareness. There is a specific episode, Brian and Stewie, Season 8, that functions as the show's most complete alternative vision of itself. The episode places Brian and Stewie alone in a bank vault for an entire episode, with no cutaway gags, no random jokes, no interruptions, no third characters, no plot mechanics beyond the vault door closing, and the two characters having to spend the night together. The entire episode is conversation, real conversation, about real things: Brian's depression, his suicidal ideation, the gun he keeps in a safety deposit box, the nature of his relationship with Stewie, what both of them actually feel about their lives. It is, by almost universal critical consensus, one of the best episodes the show ever produced after its golden first 3 seasons. It was produced in Season 8, which means it was produced at a point when the show's quality had already begun the decline that would continue through the subsequent decade and a half. But it demonstrated, beyond any dispute, that the capacity for that quality was still present. The writing was there, the voice performances were there, the willingness to be genuinely vulnerable with these characters was there. The show put that episode in Season 8 and then made Season 9, 10, 11, and every subsequent season the way it made them. The episode exists as a demonstration of what was possible. The seasons that followed exist as a demonstration of what was chosen instead. This is the mystery that sits at the center of the Quagmire speech and the Brian and Stewie episode, and the occasional moments of clarity that the show has produced across its later run. Not, where did the quality go? The quality never left. It was always there, demonstrably, in the episodes that reached for it. The mystery is, given that the quality was always there, why did the show choose, most of the time, not to reach for it? There is no clean answer to this, not one that the show has ever provided. The writers who produced Brian and Stewie in Season 8 were also the writers who produced the episodes surrounding it in that same season. The show did not have a split writing staff, a quality staff, and a lesser staff working in parallel. The same people produced the spectrum of quality. The same talent that generated the Quagmire speech generated the episodes in which Brian's character continued to be exactly what the Quagmire speech diagnosed. A show that knows exactly what is wrong with itself and can demonstrate at will that it knows how to fix it, and chooses instead to keep not fixing it. This is the most genuinely puzzling thing about Family Guy's later seasons. More puzzling than any of the mythology inconsistencies. More puzzling than the impossible geography or the fractured timeline or the immortal chicken. Those are mysteries about the world of the show. This is a mystery about the people who made it, and those are always the hardest mysteries to fully understand. Section 12 Extended, The Departed and What They Carried Out. The character of Mayor Adam West deserves a section of its own in any discussion of what Family Guy lost when it lost him. Mayor Adam West, the character, voiced by the real Adam West for the entirety of his presence on the show, was one of Family Guy's most inspired creations. The premise was simple. The actor Adam West played himself as the mayor of the fictional town in which the show was set, a man who had the actor's face and name and history, but who operated with the complete logical obliqueness of a mind that had its own rules and followed them with total conviction regardless of what everyone around him was doing. Mayor West did not explain himself. He made decisions based on criteria that were not available to anyone else in the scene. He spent public money on personal obsessions. He engaged in non sequiturs with the authority of a man reading from a teleprompter prepared by experts. He showed up at events that had nothing to do with him, contributed things that made no sense in context, and then departed as though he had performed a civic service. He had a cat named Whiskers. He once bought all the gold in town because he thought he had been infected with cat scratch fever. He expressed a romantic interest in Meg Griffin, that the show treated as one of the funnier ongoing jokes of its middle seasons. A man of his apparent vintage and social standing, directing sincere, if inexplicable attention at a teenage girl who wanted to be ignored by everyone, and was instead receiving this particular form of unlikely attention. The character worked because Adam West played it with complete, unbroken sincerity. There was never a wink. There was never a moment where the character acknowledged the comedy of his own behavior. Mayor West behaved as though his choices were the most natural choices available, as though the logic governing them was self-evident to anyone paying attention, as though the real joke was other people's confusion rather than his own conduct. This created a character who was simultaneously absurd and somehow admirable. He had, in a world full of characters who kept explaining themselves, who kept arguing for their positions, who kept asking the audience to understand and forgive their choices, complete self-certainty. He did not need anyone to agree with him. He did not adjust himself based on other people's reactions. He was, in the most unusual way, free. Adam West died in June 2017. The show acknowledged his death with care, an episode in which Mayor West dies, in which the show allowed the grief to be real rather than played for comedy, in which the depth of the character's impact on the show's world was genuinely honored. The episode was right. It found the right tone. It said goodbye appropriately. But the loss was genuinely structural. Not just the loss of a specific character or a specific actor, though both of those were significant. The loss of the quality that Mayor West embodied, that complete, unironic self-certainty, that refusal to explain himself, that freedom from the need for external validation left a specific hole in the show's social architecture. No character that came after fully occupied that particular space. The show has never quite replaced what Mayor West did for the texture of Quahog as a place. His presence made the town feel like it contained genuine eccentricity, the kind that exists in real communities and that makes those communities feel specific and alive. His absence made the town feel slightly more generic, slightly more like a constructed stage, and slightly less like a place where strange and specific people had ended up living next to each other through the ordinary accidents of geography. Tom Tucker, the news anchor, the man who delivered the town's official version of events, is the other sustained background presence, whose particular quality has kept the show's world anchored to something recognizable. Tucker is pompous and self-interested and occasionally cruel in the specific ways of a man who has confused minor local celebrity for significant cultural power. He has maintained this characterization with remarkable consistency across the show's entire run, a fact that becomes more impressive the longer you observe it. While other characters changed dramatically, expanded, contracted, lost their essential qualities or gained new ones that did not fit, Tucker remained exactly himself, episode after episode, delivering the news with the same self-satisfied authority, navigating his personal life with the same mixture of arrogance and haplessness, providing the official civic voice of a town that was organized around chaos. Tucker's consistency is its own mystery, of a quieter kind. How did this background character maintain his integrity when so many primary characters did not? The answer is probably practical. Tucker appears rarely enough and briefly enough that the writers have less opportunity to drift from his established characterization, and his role is specific enough that the temptation to explore new directions with him is limited. But the result, whatever its cause, is that Tom Tucker in Season 23 is recognizably the same person as Tom Tucker in Season 2. And this makes him something unusual in the show's architecture. He is a fixed point, a consistent reference, a man who, unlike the people at the show's center, has simply stayed himself. Section 13 Extended. The deeper theory. Every mystery we have traced tonight connects to the same center. Not to a single explanation that solves all of them. There is no such explanation and there should not be. But to a single quality that all of them share. They are all about the relationship between the show and its own reality. Between what the show says is true and what the show shows to be true. Between the claims the show makes about its world and the behavior of that world when you actually look at it. The geography claims to be Rhode Island and cannot commit to a specific location within Rhode Island. The timeline claims continuity and has been fractured by time travel into something that is not quite continuous. The characters claim identities that the show has systematically undermined: Peter as a loving father, Brian as an intellectual, Stewie as a hidden genius, Meg as just a regular teenager. The cosmology claims death as a real and serious thing, and then systematically undercuts its own seriousness about death. The town claims a population of 800 and is clearly built for a city 10 times that size. The show tells you one thing and shows you another, consistently, and the gap between the telling and the showing is where the mysteries live. They live in the gap not because anyone put them there deliberately, most of them grew there organically, the natural byproduct of 25 years of storytelling, without sufficient attention to continuity, but because that is where gaps produce them. You look at what a story says it is, and then you look at what it actually is, and in the space between those two things, you find the questions that the story does not know it is asking. Family Guy says it is about a dysfunctional family in a funny town, and it is that, but it is also in the accumulated body of its own contradictions, its own unresolved mysteries, its own implicit admissions and unexplored implications, a story about something harder to name, about what it feels like to live in a world that was built for you but that you cannot quite navigate, about the strange stability of things that should not hold together, about the people who absorb the dysfunction so others do not have to, about the relationships that make uncertainty livable, about the versions of every story that exist in parallel and that are equally real and that we will never visit, about the deaths that are undone and the truths that are spoken into rooms where no one can hear them and the chickens that keep getting up, about how a show that was made to make people laugh ended up, accidentally and over a very long time, also being a show about something else, something quieter and stranger and harder to look at directly, something that lives in the dark, comfortable spaces between episodes, in the questions that come to you when the laugh track has stopped and the town is quiet and you have time to really look at it. That is the show Family Guy turned out to be, whether it meant to or not, whether it knows it or not. Final section, what the dark is for. Here is where we have arrived, at the end of all of it. A town built for a family, organized around them, its geography shaped by their needs and its history rooted in their name. A baby who may be the only one fully present in the world he inhabits, whose elaborate schemes may be the most honest expression of a mind trying to make itself real in a world that will not quite receive it. A dog who came back from a death he experienced fully, returned to a life in which that death never happened, carrying knowledge but not the weight of what the knowledge cost. A family with histories that keep rewriting themselves, with truths distributed across different characters who hold them in different ways and share them selectively and protect them carefully. A world with God in it, and death in it, and an infinite multiverse alongside it, and an immortal chicken at its center fighting the same fight it cannot win and cannot stop fighting. A world that was built on certain specific choices about what kind of story to tell, and that kept making those choices, season after season, with full awareness of what they meant. The mysteries do not resolve. They have not resolved in 25 years, and they will not resolve in the remaining seasons that have been contracted and announced. They are not the kind of mysteries that resolve. They are the kind that accumulate, that deepen, that become more interesting the longer you carry them. What does it mean that Meg's father's name was spoken once and never followed up on? What does it mean that the town cannot be placed on a real map? What does it mean that the show diagnosed its own failures with such precision and then continued failing in exactly the ways it diagnosed? What does it mean that in an infinite multiverse, the version of this story being told is the one where things went the worst for the characters the audience cared about most? Maybe it means what the best dark things always mean, in the long quiet of a late night. That stories are not obligated to be resolved. That the question is sometimes more valuable than the answer it would replace. That the gap between what a thing says it is and what it actually is can be a more interesting space than either version alone. Family Guy told you it was a comedy, and it was, and is. And in the spaces between the comedy and the geography that cannot hold still, and the timeline that keeps fracturing, and the characters who keep shifting, and the town that keeps accommodating, and the questions that keep not getting answered, there is something else too. Something stranger and quieter and considerably more persistent than any joke. The laugh track goes silent eventually. The episode ends, the credits roll, and in the quiet that follows, the town of Quahog, Rhode Island remains, somewhere in the space where fictional places live, doing what it has always done, organizing itself around the people at its center, refusing to be found on any real map, waiting for the next episode, waiting for whoever is paying the quiet, careful kind of attention that reveals what things are when they are not performing for anyone. The chicken is already getting up. Brian does not know what he survived. Meg has not heard the answer yet. Stewie is in his room, building something. And the town is there, the way it has always been there, neither here nor there, neither the size it should be nor the size it behaves like, founded by a griffin and centered on a griffin, and unable to fully explain why it exists except that it does, and it is, and the family inside it goes on. Sleep well. The questions will be here when you wake up. They are patient. They have had 25 years of practice. If you made it all the way to the end of this, thank you, genuinely. These are the kinds of explorations that only work because someone decides to stay for all of it, and you stayed for all of it. Drop a like if these mysteries have been good company tonight, and if you want more nights like this one, subscribe. It is free and it means these keep finding you. More strange towns ahead, more questions without clean answers, more lights on in windows that should not have rooms behind them. Until next time, script for Uncle Guy Lore YouTube channel. Original, formatted for 11 Labs voiceover generation. Supplemental section, the show that survived itself. There is a specific quality to the experience of watching a television show that has outlasted its own intentions. You know what it feels like. You have experienced it with at least one show in your life, the moment when you are watching an episode and you realize, not with sadness but with a kind of quiet recognition, that the show has moved past the place where it was fully alive, where the things it produces are still competent, still recognizable, still occasionally surprising, but where the particular energy of a thing that is finding itself, that is discovering what it is capable of, that is reaching and sometimes failing and learning from the failure, that energy is no longer present in the same way it was at the beginning. Family Guy reached that point. The transcript we began with documents when and how. The showrunners who managed the show after Seth MacFarlane stepped back from active creative involvement, Rich Apple and Alex Sulkin, are people who understood the show deeply, who had been part of it for years, who brought genuine professionalism and genuine care to their work. But there is a difference between understanding a show and having built it, a difference between knowing the rules and having written them. The people who wrote the rules made different choices, in the same situations, than the people who inherited the rules would make. Not because the inheritors were less skilled, because the rules were created in response to specific instincts and specific beliefs about what this thing was supposed to be, and those instincts and beliefs do not fully transfer. They live in the person who had them, and when that person steps away, the rules remain but the living source of them does not. The show survived this. It continued. It kept going, season after season, producing episodes that were watched by fewer and fewer people but that were still produced with full professional seriousness and the complete apparatus of a functioning animated series. The mysteries it had generated, the geography, the timeline, the characters' fractured identities, the unresolved questions about the Pewter-Schmidt family and Meg's parentage and the nature of Stewie's reality, all of those kept accumulating, kept deepening, kept generating new questions in the way that all unresolved questions generate new questions when they are not addressed. And the show kept going. In April 2025, a deal was announced that would take Family Guy through its 27th season to the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. 30 years. A show that started in 1999, that was canceled twice, and brought back through the loyalty of an audience that loved it enough to buy the DVDs and watch the reruns in enormous numbers on Adult Swim in the middle of the night, will in 2029 have been producing new episodes for 30 years. More than a quarter century of the Griffin family. More than a quarter century of the impossible town of Quahog, Rhode Island. More than a quarter century of Peter and Lois and Meg and Chris and Stewie and Brian and the Drunken Clam and the brewery and the chicken fights and everything else. This fact should be more astonishing than it typically registers as being. Television history does not have many examples of an animated series running for 30 years. The Simpsons is the obvious predecessor and the obvious comparison point, and The Simpsons has been running since 1989, which makes it the anomaly rather than the standard. Family Guy at 30 years would be joining a category that contains almost nothing else. A show built for the specific comedic sensibility of the late 1990s, built around cultural references that were already dated within 5 years of the show's premiere, built to be irreverent and disposable. In the way that good irreverent comedy often is, this show will still be producing new episodes in 2029. What does a show like this owe its own history at that point? What does 30 years of storytelling generate in terms of obligation to the questions it has raised and left unresolved? Does it owe Meg an answer about Stan Thompson? Does it owe Brian an acknowledgement of what his death actually meant within the show's own timeline mechanics? Does it owe Stewie a conclusive answer about what he actually is and what his world actually contains? These are not questions anyone at Fox or Disney is likely lying awake considering. The show will continue as shows continue producing episodes, generating comedy, maintaining the infrastructure of the world it has built, occasionally reaching for something more emotionally honest, and occasionally producing something extraordinary when it does. The mysteries will continue to accumulate, as they have for 25 years. New ones will join the old ones. The ones that have been outstanding since Season 3 will still be outstanding in Season 27. And that is not a failure. That is the nature of a world that has been lived in long enough. A house that has been standing for 30 years has things in it that were put there by people who are no longer around to explain why. Drawers that are always kept closed. Rooms that are used for purposes different from what they were originally built for. Marks on doorframes that no longer correspond to the heights of anyone currently in the house. Things that are simply there, that have accumulated without anyone choosing them, that are now so embedded in the place that removing them would feel like a kind of violence. Family Guy at 30 years is that house, full of things that were put there by people who have moved on, used for purposes that were not the original design, containing marks and mysteries and unexplained presences that are now simply part of what the place is. You could go through and catalog all of them. We have spent tonight doing exactly that, and produce a document of everything that does not quite make sense, everything that was started and not finished, everyone who left without explanation. The catalog would be long and the catalog would be real. But the house is still standing. That is the other thing. All the fractures and the mysteries and the impossible geography and the death that was undone and the truth that was spoken into the wrong ear, and the house is still standing. Still lit up on Wednesday nights. Still there when you need it. Still capable, occasionally, of extraordinary things. The mysteries are not why it is still standing, but they are part of why it is interesting. They are the evidence that the house has been genuinely lived in by real people with real histories and real unresolved questions about themselves and each other. A house without any mysteries is a house without a past. A show without unanswered questions is a show that has not accumulated enough history to generate them. Family Guy has history, 25 years of it. And in that history, laid across the impossible geography of an impossible Rhode Island town, in the fractured timeline of a family whose past keeps rewriting itself, in the conversations that happened and the ones that never happened but should have, in the deaths that stuck and the ones that were reversed, and the one that was reversed using a causal paradox that the show never examined in all of it, there is something that exceeds what any one episode or any one season was trying to produce. Something that is the cumulative residue of all those choices, all those episodes, all those late nights that millions of people spent in the company of this family, in this town, turning these questions over without knowing they were turning them over. That residue is what we have been in the presence of tonight. Not the show's triumphs or its failures or its history of cancellations and revivals. Not the cultural conversation about what it means or what it used to mean. Just the quiet, specific strangeness of the world that was built here and the questions that strangeness generates when you look at it in the right kind of light. The town is there, the family is there. The chicken keeps getting up, and in the yellow wallpapered bedroom at the top of the stairs, a baby in a diaper is sitting very still, doing something that might be planning, or might be dreaming, or might be something that looks the same from outside either way. The world he inhabits may be entirely constructed from within him. The schemes he is planning may be things he will never execute. The mother he sometimes wants to destroy and sometimes runs to, and sometimes draws elaborate comfort from, may hear him or may not hear him depending on the day and the episode and what would be funniest. But he is there, and he is thinking. And whatever he is thinking, it is more complicated and more interesting and more quietly unresolved than the show has ever been willing to fully articulate. That is enough to fall asleep to. That is, in its way, everything. A final note on questions without answers. The best questions are the ones that stay with you after the conversation ends. Not because they are frustrating, though some questions are, but because they are generative, because they keep producing new angles, new associations, new ways of seeing the thing you were already looking at, because they have a kind of interior life that only activates when you are not actively trying to answer them, when you are doing something else, when your attention has been directed elsewhere and the question has been left alone long enough to start moving on its own. The questions we have explored tonight are that kind of question. They are not puzzles with solutions you can look up. They are openings, invitations to a particular quality of attention that reveals things about a show you have probably been watching for years without fully seeing. Stan Thompson is out there somewhere, as a name attached to an implication that the show generated and abandoned. Stewie's comprehension rules are inconsistent in a way that points towards something the show knows but will not say plainly. Brian came back through a mechanism that made him a copy of the Brian who died rather than that Brian himself. The town of Quahog exists in a geographic superposition, being simultaneously west of Providence and near the coast and near Tiverton and modeled on Cranston. Peter was born in Mexico under circumstances that should mean he does not technically exist as a legal person in the country he has lived in his entire life. Meg sat with headphones on while the truth about her was spoken in the room. The chicken gets up every time. These are the things the show has generated, Not through intention or design, or at least not entirely through intention or design. Through accumulation. Through the natural process of what happens when you tell enough stories in the same world about the same people for long enough. All those stories, all those questions, all those things that were started and not finished, said and not followed up on, depicted and not resolved. A world can hold all of that. A world that has been built over time, lived in over time, accumulated over time, can hold enormous amounts of unresolved material without collapsing. The unresolved material becomes part of the texture, part of what makes the place feel real, in the specific way that fictional places become real, through the accumulation of specific detail and specific inconsistency and specific implication that exceeds what any single intention could have produced. Family Guy is real in that way, more real than its absurdist logic would suggest a show should be able to be. Real in the way that matters most for falling asleep to specific enough that the mind can inhabit it, detailed enough that it holds your imagination without requiring your active participation, strange enough that the questions it raises are the kind that carry you into sleep rather than keeping you out of it. Good questions do not require answers before they let you rest. They are content to drift with you, to be there when you close your eyes, to occupy the space between thoughts with the gentle insistence of something unresolved but not urgent. Stewie is still building something. The town is still there. The geography is still wrong. The chicken is still going to get up. Whatever you were worried about tonight, it can wait until morning. Sleep now. We will still be here when you wake up. Thank you for being here tonight. For all of it. For following the geography and the timelines and the voices and the deaths and the theories and the questions all the way to the end. This is the kind of video that only exists because someone watches it, and you watched it. If you want more of this, more quiet late nights in strange fictional worlds, more questions that do not have clean answers, the subscribe button is there. It is free, and it means the algorithm knows you want these, which means they keep arriving. And leave a comment. Tell us where you are, what time it is, what question from tonight is still turning over in your mind. There is always something that catches and will not let go. We would love to know which one it was for you. Until next time, sleep well. Script Uncle Guy lore. Original content. Researched and written for 11 Labs voiceover generation. Total runtime approximately 2 hours 30 minutes at standard narration pace. Appendix. The things we almost said? There is a category of mystery in Family Guy that sits adjacent to everything we have discussed tonight, one that deserves at least some time before we fully close. These are the things the show almost addressed. Not the questions it forgot to ask. The questions it built up to, got within reach of, and then swerved away from at the last moment, leaving the audience with the exact shape of an answer without the answer itself. The Fat Guy Strangler episode, which revealed the existence of Patrick Pewterschmidt, came very close to a full examination of what the Pewterschmidt household had actually been. The episode had the structure of a genuine revelation. Lois discovers she has a brother she never knew existed, a brother institutionalized and hidden by their father, a man whose breakdown was caused by something traumatic in the family home. The material was there for an episode that examined Carter Pewterschmidt as something darker than a comedic villain, that asked seriously what kind of childhood Lois had, that used Patrick's story as a lens for understanding everything that Lois has kept carefully managed in her own history. The show did not go there. It used Patrick's existence as a comedic premise, the serial strangler brother, the dark secret, the family photograph with the erased figure, and then moved on to the episode's joke mechanics. Patrick appeared, served his plot function, and was returned to his institutionalized status off-screen. He has not been the subject of a serious follow-up. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode came very close to a genuine reckoning with what had been done to Meg across the preceding seasons. Meg's speech in that episode is, as we discussed, accurate and raw and specific. Everything she says is documentably true. The scene is written as though the writers had finally decided to address the accumulation of cruelty directly, to let it be named and felt and given the weight it actually had. And then the episode's ending undid that by having Meg return to her position, by using the occasion of her rebellion to prove why the rebellion was unsustainable. The show almost said something. It got all the way to the door and then turned around. The Brian Writes a Bestseller episode, often cited as the moment Brian became fully insufferable, rather than just somewhat insufferable, came very close to a genuine examination of the relationship between creative, ambition, and personal integrity. Brian's book is terrible. His success with it is the success of something he despises, something that represents the opposite of what he claims to care about as a writer. The episode could have been a sustained engagement with what it means to compromise your stated values for attention and validation, with the specific kind of self-knowledge that would be required to recognize that you are doing this and to feel genuinely troubled by it. Brian could have felt the contradiction between his self-image and his behavior in a way that changed something. Instead, the episode used the material to make Brian behave badly towards Stewie. The badness was the joke, and the deeper question went unasked. The show kept doing this, getting close to the thing it was actually generating material for, and then deploying the material for jokes rather than for the examination the material was pointed toward. This is not unique to Family Guy. Comedy shows routinely sacrifice depth for laughs, and the argument that this is simply a comedy show doing comedy things is a completely valid one. But the specific quality of Family Guy's near misses is worth noting. The near misses are often extraordinarily close. The material assembled for them is often exactly the material you would need for the serious examination that was not attempted. The show knew what it had, and it deployed it sideways. All of those near misses are part of the mystery, not because they contain hidden answers to the questions we have been asking, but because they demonstrate, again and again, that the show had access to those answers. The answers were available. The examination was possible. The writers assembled the material that a genuine engagement would have required. And then they used the material for the joke instead. And the answer stayed in the room, unspoken, while the audience laughed at something adjacent to it. What does it mean that a show kept generating material for examinations it never performed? What does it say about the nature of the world it was building? That the world kept producing the conditions for genuine depth without the depth being realized? Perhaps nothing systematic. Perhaps each individual near miss had its own specific cause, a joke that was too good to pass up, an executive note that redirected the story, a writer's room that moved in a different direction than the material was pointing. Perhaps the accumulation of near misses is not a pattern but a coincidence. Or perhaps the show built a world that was genuinely dark and complicated underneath its comic surface, that kept generating the materials of genuine examination out of the simple logic of what happens when you tell enough stories about people with real histories in a world with real contradictions. And the show simply never knew quite what to do with what it kept producing. Like a person who keeps starting sentences that their courage fails to finish. The beginning of the sentence is there. The intention is recognizable. The destination exists somewhere. But between the beginning and the destination, there is a gap that keeps not being crossed. The near misses are not failures exactly. They are evidence. Evidence that the show was, beneath its comedy, genuinely grappling with things it could not quite bring itself to say directly. And that grappling visible in the shapes of all the examinations that were almost performed in the near misses that keep accumulating across 25 seasons is itself a kind of honesty. Not the honesty of saying the thing. The honesty of not being able to pretend the thing does not exist. That is enough. That is more than enough for a show that was built to make people laugh. That it kept generating the conditions for something deeper, kept assembling the materials, kept getting to the door that is the show telling you what it was made of, in the only language it fully knew how to use. End of script. Word count, approximately 30,000 words. Estimated video runtime. 2 hours 30 minutes to 3 hours at standard ASMR narration pace. One final thing on caring about fictional worlds. People sometimes ask why anyone spends serious thought on a cartoon. Why trace the geography of a fictional Rhode Island town? Why care about the timeline mechanics of a baby's time machine? Why it matters that a dog came back through a paradox rather than cleanly? Why give serious attention to a show that spent significant portions of its own run making jokes about how little serious attention it deserved? The answer is not complicated. It is just this. When you care about a fictional world, you are practicing something real. You are practicing the particular kind of attention that notices what things are actually doing rather than just what they say they are doing. You are practicing the habit of looking at something familiar and asking whether the familiar surface is the whole story. You are practicing patience with questions that cannot be quickly resolved, with contradictions that do not collapse into single, clean truths, with the specific quality of uncertainty that the best mysteries maintain. These are not fictional skills. They are real ones. And fiction is where many people first develop them, where those skills feel safe enough to try without consequence, where you can ask whether the geography makes sense, and whether the timeline holds up, and whether the character is who they claim to be, without anything at stake except the pleasure of the inquiry itself. Family Guy gave millions of people a world to practice this in, a world full of material, a world that keeps generating questions and never quite answering them. A world of such unusual specific richness, the impossible town, the fractured timeline, the baby who may be imagining all of it, the dog who came back through a causal loop, the girl who cannot hear the answer to the most important question about herself. That 25 years of attention to it has not exhausted what it contains. This is what the best fiction does. Not just entertain, create a world that can be inhabited thoughtfully as well as passively. A world that rewards the person who decides to really look at it, who brings the same quality of attention to the question of where Quahog is on a map that they might bring to more conventionally serious subjects. A world that meets that attention with genuine strangeness and genuine depth and genuine mystery. Family Guy, for all its failures and all the ways it changed from what it was, for all the character diminishments and the cutaway overloads and the lost heart of the early seasons, is still that world. It still has those qualities. The questions we have spent tonight exploring are genuine questions, and they are genuine because the world that generated them was built with enough care and enough specificity that it could generate genuine questions. A world built carelessly cannot produce genuine mysteries. It can only produce inconsistencies. The difference between an inconsistency and a mystery is whether the inconsistency points somewhere, whether it implies something, whether sitting with it produces something more than irritation. Family Guy's inconsistencies produce something more than irritation. They produce the particular quality of late-night contemplation we have been engaged in tonight, comfortable, atmospheric, carrying just enough strangeness to keep the mind gently active while the body settles. That is what the show built, and what it has maintained, through 25 years of stories. Not perfectly, not always, but enough. More than enough for a night like this one. The chicken is getting up again somewhere. The baby is planning something. The dog does not know what he survived. And the town of Quahog, Rhode Island, wherever it is, whatever size it actually is, however many people actually live in it, is still there, still lit, still impossible, still home. Good night,